Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to speak with like-minded baseball enthusiasts and historians. This book is titled, Do You Believe in Magic? Baseball in America in the Groundbreaking Year of 1966. I hadn't seen a lot of scholarship about 66, so it seemed ripe for exploration. I want to talk about three things. I'll talk a little bit about the cultural change that was going on in 66. I'll talk a little bit about some of the historical events that were taking place that year, but the bulk of the presentation will be about, of course, the baseball season. The cultural change, I'm a TV guy. I love entertainment history. And of course, Batman struck my fancy when I was researching this. I could have done 100 pages on Batman easily. Batman premieres in January. No one had ever seen anything like that on television. It was a comic book on screen, but so over the top. And yet you needed good actors to pull that off. So you had Cesar Romero, Burgess Meredith, Julie Newmar, Joan Collins, Victor Buono, Frank Gorshin, John Astin, Art Carney, Roddy McDowell, David Wayne. These were real Class A actors. And when you're a kid, you buy into it. When you're an adult, you see it's all camp and fantasy. That set off a superhero trend. In fall of 66, you may remember, for those of us who are old enough to remember, CBS's Saturday morning lineup was called Super Saturday, because once Hollywood has a success, all of the other producers, networks, and studios tried to piggyback on top of it. You had Frankenstein Jr. and the Impossibles. You had the Green Hornet premiered on ABC. That was also a William Dozier production. William Dozier produced Batman. Green Hornet didn't last too long. Batman didn't last too long. Only 2.5 years, but it did make an imprint on the culture. Spies were also fodder because of James Bond and Dr. No. Then you had The Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., Get Smart. If you remember the comedy team Alan Rossi, The Last of the Secret Agents, that was a parody. By the end of the decade, the Cold War spy genre had died out somewhat. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was off the air. Get Smart lasted, I believe, a little bit into the 70s, not much. And then you had things like surfing with the Beach Boys. That was a trend. Beatlemania, that induced the British invasion, the Rolling Stones, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and so forth. So there was a lot of change. It was very volatile in the culture. Historically, politically, of course, Vietnam escalated. You had the Miranda, the Miranda decision in 1966, which I talk about in the book. First Black female court, first Black female justice on the federal court in 1966. She was nominated in January, but Republicans were playing political games, and she finally got confirmed during the summer. She figures prominently in two baseball cases, which we don't have time to go into here. One of them was the Brooklyn Dodger trademark case, where the Dodgers sued a bar that was using the Brooklyn Dodger name. And this judge said, you abandoned the city, you abandoned Brooklyn, you abandoned your fans. So how can you claim that it's trademark infringement? The judge's name was Constance Baker Motley. She also was involved in Melissa Lutke's case, where Melissa wanted access to the Yankees clubhouse after a game, before a game. And Judge Motley basically said, look, you can bar all of the reporters if you want, but you can't bar some based on a category. You can't just say the men are allowed and the women aren't. That's where leads are developed. That's where rapport is built. You just cannot do that. It's unfair. So either bar them all or let them all in. And some of you may know Melissa from the SABR conferences. So that brings us to baseball. Also, a very volatile decade for baseball. And in 66, certainly it was volatile. You have Marvin Miller, whom some of you may believe should have been in the Hall of Fame years ago. He was looked at askance. For anyone who thinks that Marvin Miller came into baseball, came into the union and told the players what to do and had 100% unanimous vote. Nothing could be further from the truth. You had some veteran players who said, look, I have a good rapport with the owners. You're going to come in, you'll be a crybaby, you're going to interfere with my relationship. I'm trying to put bread on the table, feed my family. I have 8 years, 9 years, 10 years in the majors. Why should I trust you? Well, Marvin Miller pretty much went on a listening tour and wanted to know about the quality of life. It's not just the money, it's also the quality of life. For example, if you're a ball player and your team is on a 9-game road trip and you return on a Monday, do you play Monday night? Things like that. What are the hotel rooms like? What are the clubhouses like? And so forth. So he soon got the unanimous vote. He soon got, informally or formally, he soon got the respect that he needed from the players, but he was not going in to confront the owners just to confront them. He wanted fairness. And he said, I'm a mouthpiece. I'm not going to tell you guys what to do. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I'm the conduit between you and the owners. I'm going to let you know what the owners say. I'm going to speak for you, but in no way am I going to tell you what to argue. I'm just going to lay out the facts and the arguments as I see them. Koufax and Drysdale. Well, some people make the mistake that the Sandy Koufax, Don Drysdale holdout was related to Marvin Miller. It was not. It was totally separate. So Drysdale and Koufax get together and they form a joint coalition against Buzzy Bavasi, who was the Dodgers GM. They want more money. Now, I had heard about this holdout. I did not realize until I started doing the research that this went on for several weeks, not several days, about a month. So when I'm researching the LA Times and the LA Herald Examiner, I'm looking for quotes. The Herald Examiner might have a different quote than the Times, might have a different salary reported, et cetera. So that's why in the book, you'll see I have both newspapers in the end notes. They finally got together, and the reason that they came to an agreement with the Dodgers was because of a gentleman whom you may all remember, Chuck Connors. Chuck Connors, the rifleman, Chuck Connors, the TV star, Chuck Connors, the former Chicago Cub, the former Dodger, obviously still had a pipeline to players, a pipeline to Dodgers management. In the book, you'll see there's a picture of the press conference. And at the table is Bavasi, Koufax, Drysdale, and Connors. He's not off to the side. He's literally at the table with the other three. He was instrumental in getting this done. Now, we don't know what was said to them, but I imagine it was something along the lines of, how much further do you want to push this? And there was talk of Koufax and Drysdale going to Hollywood, going into movies and things like that. And he had experience on that side of the camera. So he probably told them what to expect. But at the end of the day, it was good for baseball. The other faction besides Dodger Nation that was really mournful and worried about this were the GMs and owners across the National League, because Koufax and Drysdale starting on road trips means money in the coffers for the Mets, the Reds, the Cubs, the Phillies. So automatically, when an all-star is going to pitch, especially guys of their caliber, your revenues will go up. They're not pitching, your revenues are going to go down. So that was a really interesting thing to explore as well. In '66, the Dodgers have their, how shall I say this delicately, their beginning of a descent. '66, they lose the World Series to the Orioles in 4 games. They lose Sandy Koufax. He retires in November. He says, I just can't do it. My arm is in pain. I'm tired of the shots. I just don't want to do this. And look, he had a great run. He had been around since the mid-50s, but it was only since '62 where he became dominant. And what a fantastic 5 years. He had 4 no-hitters. 1 was a perfect game. And Dodger Nation lost a lot. Drysdale retires 3 years later. And the Dodgers don't get back to the series until '74. And then again in '77 and '78, they lost all 3 times, but they got on top of the NL competition. That's a pretty a pretty good marker to own when you're atop the National League in the 70s. I'll talk about the Orioles for just a second. The Orioles were a young squad. Jim Palmer wasn't even 21, couldn't even vote in those days. 21 was the voting age. And Hank Bauer, of course, was the manager. Young ball club. To say that they dominated the Dodgers is incorrect. 4 games, but low-scoring games. I think 2 games were 1-0. Claude Osteen pitched a 3-hitter in 1 game through, I believe it was 7 innings. One of the hits was a home run by Paul Blair. That decided the game. It was just that kind of a thing. Willie Davis committing 3 errors in the outfield. Some of you may remember that. 3 errors in 1/2 inning. The problem, though, is if you talk to Dodgers fans, they will tell you to a person, I'm sure, that my guys were tired. Because the Dodgers were in a 3-way pennant race at the beginning of September. They clinched on the last day of the season, pretty much. The Orioles had clinched around the 21st of September. Well, you all follow baseball. What happens when you clinch 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the end of the season? You can rest your starters. You can give them a break. Not every error is crucial. Not every man on base is crucial. It's not that they let up, but the mental pressure is off. The Dodgers didn't have that luxury. So they're going full force. By the time they get to the World Series, they are tired. However, we cannot discount Mo Drabowsky in game 1. Mo Drabowsky had been changed into a long reliever. He had been a starter. He had been a journeyman. He winds up in Baltimore, and they say, you're going to be a relief pitcher. You're not in the starting lineup. We don't need you there. Well, McNally gets in trouble. Dave McNally gets in trouble in game 1. In comes Mo from the bullpen. And Mo, as the baseball card says the next year, Mo mows them down. Sets a relief pitcher's record for strikeouts in a World Series game. Was the hero of Baltimore. His name rings out. Now, there's a sad postscript to the story, and if you read the book, I encourage you to go past chapter 12 because there's an appendix. There's a poem that describes Mo Drabowsky's life. Now, you might believe in karma, you might believe in fate, you might believe in the supernatural. So what I'm about to tell you will affirm that. If you don't believe in those things, maybe this will make you think a little bit about it. Mo pitched that game on October 5th, 7 years to the day before the game. His infant daughter died of leukemia. She was only 2 months old. And I believe that he did have an angel on his shoulder that day. Because what are the odds that Dave McNally will get tagged by the Dodgers to that extent where Hank Bauer calls in Mo from the bullpen early in the game, not in the 7th inning or 8th inning. It was early. And it's just one of those stories that recalls for me Brad Pitt in Moneyball, where he says, who says you can't be romantic about baseball? It's unlike any other sport. So I dedicated the book to 2 women or girls. One was my mom, and the other is Deborah, the infant daughter. The family was a tremendous help in giving me background on Mo. Such a fun-loving guy. He was a prankster. He would put goldfish in the opposing team's water coolers. He gave Bowie Kuhn a hot foot, the commissioner of baseball. He's pranking the commissioner of baseball. It's just a great story. It's a heartwarming story. It's a heart-wrenching story on another level. And I really wanted to get that in there. There was a reason that I wrote the book, and I didn't know it at the time that I agreed to write it, but I think it was to tell that story. 66, as we talked about, Sandy Koufax retires. That is just a phenomenal record that he had when you look at the 5 years before, the 5 seasons before. I mean, if you look at pictures of him around that time, if you're even the diehard Dodgers fan has to understand his arm is in ice after the game. It looks so painful when you see pictures of him in the locker room, to be soaking your elbow in ice and then to be answering questions. He was just a phenomenal force for a small period of time. And I can only imagine in Dodger Nation, there were a lot of tears, a lot of mourning going on. Somebody at another SABR event had asked me about the Yankees and whether I talked about them. Not a lot, but the Yankees were on a downswing as well. 64, they lost the World Series to the Cardinals, and it really wasn't until 12 years later that they got back to the World Series against the Reds, and then lost 77 and 78. They win. Lots of other characters in 66. I didn't have time to put them all in the book, but you can certainly read about them in other sources. Hank Aaron, Roberto Clemente, certainly you just had phenomenal people. The Mets were still trying to find their way, so there wasn't a lot going on regarding the Mets that I spoke about in 66. But just in conclusion, I think it was just one of those years that gets overlooked because it's not as flashy as 68. It's not as flashy as 67 with the Red Sox in the Cinderella season. 69 had the miracle Mets. We talk about the 62 Mets all the time. I wrote a book about 1962. 61 had Maris and Mantle with the home run chase. 66 has been one of those overlooked years. And I hope that if you read the book, you'll read more about Baltimore, more about Los Angeles, and just close by saying this began the descent of LA, but also the ascent of Baltimore. Baltimore does not get back to the series in 67 and 68, but in 69, they begin a 3-year reign as AL champs, and they win the World Series 1 out of those 3 years. But to three-peat as the head of your league is a pretty formidable achievement, I think, anyway. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions that you might have.
Thank you, David. Can you hear us?
I can.
Good. So Mark Cantor, who comes to us from Rhode Island. Go ahead, please.
I don't know if you can see me.
No.
All right, but I'm writing a paper in a book, a SABR book called. It's about Sandy Koufax's every game he ever pitched, and I think it's every game he ever pitched in the major league, something like that. And I'm writing the article on his last major league win, the game in Philly, the second game of the doubleheader. I think
Right.
It's October 2nd, October 3rd. After the game, he makes a statement. I don't have the quote in front of me, but he makes a statement like, "Thank God it's over." He makes a statement, and the reason that this is such a the reason this is so important is that I was just on a trip to Japan and Korea with Bob Bavasi, Buzzy's son. Buzzy is Japan Ball, and I gave him the paper that I'm writing. And Bob was only 12 at the time, but his older brother Peter was 27. So he sent it up to Peter and said, "So what do you think?" Peter said, "Oh my God." Sandy knew he was retiring.
Yeah.
And they were shocked at that quote that they didn't know about. They had no idea at the time. Today, it's come out that Sandy did talk with doctors before the season and all that.
Right.
Another thing that Bob said on a previous trip was his father took a bath when Sandy and Don Drysdale actually signed with the Dodgers, because I guess he gave somebody an extra $10,000. He gave one of the pitchers an extra $10,000, and he figured O'Malley would just cover it. at the end of the year, O'Malley took $10,000 out of Buzzy's bonus. That's how it was covered. If you believe what Bob LeBase says, and Bob and I have a pretty good relationship, so I have to believe what he said. So those are just two things about the 66 season there.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Other comments?
David, I have a Batman question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned a lot of famous actors who were in the series, and two of them I didn't remember being there, John Astin and Joan Collins. What did they play?
Joan Collins played Siren, and John Astin and Frank Gorshin both played the Riddler at different times.
Wow. Thank you.
You guys know that John Ashton's a big baseball fan.
Yeah.
Good. If I may, David, a couple of things, so unless anybody wants to go ahead of me. Regarding Koufax, as great as he was, you know, he had competition from Gibson and Marichal, and to what extent did Koufax in particular and the Dodger pitchers in general benefit from an extremely favorable home park and in an extreme pitcher's era? I was always a big Marichal fan. In fact, I personally think he should have won the '66 Cy Young Award as an aside. But another thing I wanted to bring up is that in '66 was the last year of only one Cy Young Award. Now, what I'm thinking about either doing an article or maybe a presentation for Minneapolis next year. Cott had his big year in '66, the year after the Twins won the pennant.
Right.
Had there been an American League Cy Young Award, I think Cott would have been a strong candidate, even though the Twins didn't win. I also think that, to your point, David, about that run that the Orioles had in '69, '71, that's got to be one of the strongest teams,
Well,
you know, since expansion. That team was a real powerhouse.
I agree. Regarding your question about the Dodgers, I'd have to do more analysis, but I know that the San Francisco Giants, once I started doing books about the 60s, I didn't realize this at the time, but now I know they were the best second place team in baseball. 4 or 5 years, they ran second.
Yeah.
And look, when you have Koufax and Drysdale, when you have Maury Wills on base, you might not need as many runs as other teams would need to win.
Yeah.
What was the last part of your question?
Well, what I was saying is that in those years, for the most part, the vast majority of the time, the pennant-winning teams usually had the MVPs and the Cy Youngs,
Right.
and I've always thought Marichal's been overlooked. I did a presentation at a math conference where I think Marichal should have won the '66 Cy Young Award, but you know, Koufax was also the glamorous white guy in an era when the Black and Latin players were starting to get more recognition. But Clemente used to feel, as some of you might remember, that the Latin players in particular didn't get the recognition they deserved until much later on. So, you know, by the way, one thing to add to your cultural landscape, Hogan's Heroes, one of my favorites.
Oh, without a doubt. But it's interesting because we could play the Stratomatic Hall of Fame edition. We could split up into pairs, and everybody in this room will have a draft choice from the 1960s. And everybody in this room might pick a different player. You might pick Marichal, I'll pick Drysdale. You might pick Clemente, I'll pick McCovey. So that's what makes baseball. You know, it's the arguments, the debates. You know, Koufax towards the end, I'm just looking at Baseball Reference. 3 out of the last 4 years, he leads in wins, leads the majors. He had the top NL ERA for the last 5 seasons. And for 3 of those seasons, he led the majors. Just overpowering. You can't say enough about him. Drysdale, when you talk about Drysdale, you know, 62, he won 25 games. He was the Cy Young. Maury Wills stolen base record, 104. I had not realized until I did the research, Tommy Davis was such a force in 62 and
Yeah.
throughout the 60s, but he leads the majors. So when it's like Reggie Jackson, the Yankees, these other players, as much as they accomplish, Mantle and Maris, they overshadowed Elston Howard in that 61 season. It's just what happens because of media coverage, because something has more sex appeal than something else. A home run race has more sex appeal, more media coverage than a batting race. Maybe that wasn't that way in the 50s, but it certainly became that way in the age of television. As TV matured, in the 60s, we had TV in the 50s, but I don't think it was until the end of the decade that TV was ubiquitous in homes. In the early 50s, you still had to be of some means to have a television.
Well, it's funny, you talk about the Latin and Latin players and all that. This is gonna sound really crazy. I actually believe that Willie Mays is the most underappreciated superstar to ever play the game.
Mhm.
Willie Mays could have won 6 MVPs. I'm convinced of that.
Well,
the year that Maury Wills wins the MVP, Willie Mays is much better.
Parking the wrong parking lot over there.
there are some fans of the Braves who might argue that Hank Aaron was unappreciated and is still unappreciated because he played in a small market city. If he had played in Chicago or Philly or New York or LA, that might have been different. So again, it's what makes baseball. It's what makes baseball great, that we can have these arguments, that we could do Moneyball analysis, that we could conjecture, would Ted Williams have been better in a Yankees uniform than Joe DiMaggio if Ted Williams had played for the Yankees instead of Boston? That's why we have the Baseball Research Journal. That's why you guys are working on papers for Minnesota. Maybe you're working on papers for the 19th Century Conference. I know Bill will probably be there. It's that kind of a thing. And people always ask me, hasn't everything been written about baseball? I said, no, everything hasn't been written about baseball. What do we have, like a dozen people in the room? If I gave everyone an assignment to write a book about Lou Gehrig, I would get a dozen different viewpoints. Same with Willie Mays, same with the Yankees, same with Walter O'Malley, with Jackie Robinson. Everybody comes at a topic with a different perspective. And I think that's part of the beauty of baseball, that there will be another book about the 66 season. Maybe someone will write a book about this, the 69 to 71 Orioles. You mentioned that that team was very powerful. Another team that gets overlooked is the Royals of the late 70s, because they always lost to the Yankees in the ALCS. But they were dominant. Hal McRae and Amos Otis and George Brett. Someone someday will write a book or do a paper about those guys.
I think, you look at the Orioles in the late 60s, the Royals, yes, they had the same thing as the Braves of the 1990s. They never won the World Series.
Right.
They won one World Series. They didn't win like the A's in the early 70s and won 3 World Series.
Right.
And, you don't win, you don't get the same type of recognition.
Exactly.
And I think to add to this discussion about the media coverage, so I think a lot of people in this room, we got some more people now. People in this room know that I'm a big Jimmy Fox booster, because if he played in New York, I think people would have realized how great he was. I mean, as much as I'm a big Yankee fan, I think Fox was a more complete player than Gehrig. In fact, I don't even think it's all that close. But my dad got me a present in the mid-'80s, The Hidden Game of Baseball by Palmer and Thorne, and that was one of the early things, in addition to Bill James, that got people thinking about, ballpark factors and league conditions and stuff of that nature.
Right. And at another SABR chapter, I gave this presentation and somebody brought up Hank Bauer, that Hank Bauer is underappreciated, undervalued as a manager of the Orioles. He knew how to win all those years under Casey Stengel with the Yankees. And we can't discount the managerial aspect. I don't think that gets enough scholarship in SABR research, at least not yet. But I believe that day is coming where people will start scrutinizing their strategies and the X factor that the managers who knew how to win, who used their players to the best extent possible. Somebody had written a wonderful baseball research journal article about Leo DeRocher and the Cubs and how he overused his stars. So by the end of '69, they were kaput. The Mets overran them. If Gil Hodges had managed the Cubs might have gone to the World Series that year.
If I may add to what you're saying, David, and Debbie, so Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to point out in relation to Mark's point about Mays being underrated. I just read the Baseball 100 by Joe Posnanski over the summer, and he has Willie Mays, my hero, rated as the #1 player of all time.
I think you could debate that because especially with the advent of the recognition of the Negro League players, although the stats are incomplete, that would add to the debate, but that's I've seen that. I wanted to ask David.
Actually, he does have Negro League players in the top 10.
Okay. Like Oscar Charleston, probably, people like that.
Maybe too, they would add if they would add his Negro League stuff into his other stuff. He added them on, right? The Major League
That's what you would do, obviously you would add in whatever Hank Aaron did, whatever Ernie Banks did in the Major League, whatever Roy Campanella did in the League. I think Roy Campanella becomes this uber star, right? I mean, I don't know his numbers in the Negro Leagues, but he started when he was 15, so.
Right.
And David, could you comment, please, in addition to this, what you said about managing? Did your book touch upon Hank Bauer as a manager? Because you're right about the pedigree before that.
I didn't touch on that too much. It was tough to find information about it. And nowadays, I mean, Bill will tell you, publishers want you to write less. I mean, this book was cut down considerably. The cost of paper is skyrocketing. So you really have to be judicious with what you write about. And a lot of stuff gets victimized by the red pen. The first rule of writing is throw your darlings overboard. You have to be willing to do that just because you don't have infinite space. So unfortunately, I didn't get into a lot of the managerial aspects of Walter Alston or Hank Bauer.
Okay, other questions? Everyone, for those who just got in, this is David Krell. Mark, please, go ahead.
I'm not sure which way I'm speaking to, why do you feel the Orioles fell off so badly in 1967? And do you feel like Hank Bauer didn't quite have enough rope to, be there when the team turned around by late 68, 69, or we were already taken over by then?
What's the question? Why was Bauer fired?
Oh, two things. Basically, it's two-part. Basically, why did the Orioles fall off so badly in 1967? And do you feel like Bauer didn't get a short rope? If you win the World Series in 66, and you're gone by early 68, he was gone by.
That part I'm not sure about. I'd have to do more research. Look, the Red Sox just had a tremendous year in '67. Sometimes teams just catch fire. It was one of those magical seasons. I have a book coming out about the Red Sox in April, and you read those archival copies of the newspapers from '67. It really was a community. Everyone was pulling for them. It was something that the Boston I don't think has seen since, even in '75. There was just something about the '67 season to me. Now, I was born in '67, so I'm just going on what people told me and what I've seen in the newspaper accounts. There was just something very powerful about that team. Everything clicked, everything came together. And the Orioles, remember, were a pretty young squad. So they were still kind of feeling their way. And by the time they got to '69, they were a more mature group. Jim Palmer was seasoned, McNally was seasoned. So there was a more experience that they had coming into the late '60s than in the mid '60s. And I think that's a factor.
One thing that happened in 1967 is almost every one of the Oriole pitchers got a sore arm. You think the guys who were in the series, Wally Bunker, Jim Palmer, Steve Barber, Dave McNally, they all got sore arms, and Hank Bauer took it personally. He'd say to them, like, I'm not gonna stand for any more of these sore arms, I'm sending these guys out. You know, and he just got angry about it. In fact, these guys were hurt, but you look at the pitching staff, the whole thing, Palmer came back, eventually McNally came back. But the next year, they all got hurt.
Maybe I could plant the short rope that Bauer got. Maybe they like the way he's handling pitching, you know?
And he seemed like just an old school kind of tough guy manager, and he just
Yeah.
got angry when people got hurt.
What year did Frank Robinson get hurt on the
Yeah,
squad?
that was the same year.
Al White.
Robinson also got hurt that year.
And so the other thing is about the pitching is, at the end of '68, Jim Palmer was exposed in the expansion draft. And nobody took him. And then he comes back and has the great career.
And I think to add to that, Mark, you're asking a very good question, that Frank Robinson's injury, as I remember reading, carried over from '67 to
He
'68.
was never the same player.
Yeah,
He was Frank Robinson. If you look at his numbers, he was very good. But that injury really messed up his head, because he got concussed there. And his numbers were never as good again.
he had some decent years, but you're right, not like, you know, Triple Crown or early '60s.
Part of that could have been just aging, though.
That's right, but the injury didn't help.
What does that mean for Anthony Rizzo?
Well, that's why didn't the Yankees figure out that? That's an excellent point. They took 3 months to figure out that Rizzo had a concussion.
Right.
The face over to talk about, because you know, you always hear the Red Sox story, and it's fine, dandy, but we all know the Red Sox story, but I never knew, you know, I'm born in '72, so I never knew why the Orioles fell so bad in '67, like, you know, go from world champs, like 10 games, 9 games, or 500, whatever they were. You know, to eventually losing their manager the following year, halfway through, before becoming a powerhouse yet again, emerging. I never knew why '67 were so bad. You know, now I see they got hurt, all the pitchers collapsed pretty much. You know, makes sense.
I think to add, to relate this to David's point, your point from before about '67, that there was a 4-team race that went down to the final day of the season, and it's not every day you get that sort of thing.
That's what Baltimore wasn't there to dominate them, you know, 'cause that's the thing. Baltimore wasn't there to dominate like he did in the late '60s. That's the thing, you know. The Yankees have been there to dominate all along. And then there's like, I guess it's chaos once the Yankee dynasty collapses. The Orioles filled the vacuum up, like you know, David pointed out, they weren't quite mature yet. They had dealt with injuries, and you know, as Bill was saying, by '69 they were seasoned. Jim Palmer somehow didn't get drafted by someone, you know, the Royals or the Pilots, or whoever that exposed the Padres, whatever. But in Earl Weaver, of course, being Earl Weaver, the Orioles then became the power for the next 3 years. I mean, or beyond that too, but really for 3 years they were dominant team in the American League.
Well, there's also a cultural element to the media coverage. It's under the radar. It's totally intangible in my opinion, but Baltimore and LA were both transplant teams. The Dodgers came from Brooklyn, the Orioles came from St. Louis. When you talk about the Red Sox, when you talk about the Tigers, these teams had been around for an awful long time. So a 12-year-old going to the ballpark with his grandfather, the grandfather could tell him about when he was 12 at the same ballpark and saw pitchers and saw hitters that the kid is reading about in history books. It's not that way with Baltimore and LA. And the same with the guys from the media who are covering it. If they were homegrown Bostonians or people who lived in Detroit or New York for the Yankees, they know, you know, they know the emotions, they know the ups and downs, they know the community, and there's a different kind of coverage in the media. You can sense it. It's palpable. It's palpable. And I'm not even sure that people understand it when they're doing it. This could be my over-romantic notion of it, but that's just the feeling I got doing research about Baltimore in '66 versus media coverage on Boston in '67.
Well, you know, it's funny you should say that. My team blew the National Pennant this week. But it's funny to say that because in Philly, We have all that history, right?
Yep.
We have the history of the Yankees. We have the history that the anvil will fall at some point. In Arizona, they don't have that history.
Right.
And Arizona can play things loosey-goosey, but in Philly, when you know the hammer's gonna be there at some point, you can't play that game.
If Arizona loses, the media coverage, the fan outcry is a lot different and can't nearly be as emotional as the outpouring from, I saw the Philly fans on YouTube.
Yep.
You know, they feel it in their bones in Philadelphia.
I
It's a
can't even
different-
watch it. I can't even watch the World Series. I
Right.
can't even watch it. I mean.
That was like us in 2004.
Right.
Good point, Gary.
Couldn't watch it.
Yes, understood.
But you make a good point, David, about that, you know, if you're, you know, now. I would say after 50 or 60 or 70 years in Baltimore. You know, it's pretty much, you know, it's different now than it was 10.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's not that they didn't have baseball in Baltimore. Baltimore has a rich lineage going back to the 1800s. But when I'm talking about a specific team,
Yeah.
the team had only been around since 54.
David, if I may follow up on that and to Mark's point, and I was rooting for the Phillies, by the way.
So.
I remember when I lived in Delaware in the 70s, so I dealt with a lot of the Philly fans, like we owe you one, we owe you two kind of stuff. We would go down to Memorial Stadium when the Yankees came in and Catfish Hunter was facing Jim Palmer. Now, at that time, the late 70s, Memorial Stadium was packed. Where I'm going with this is with your book about 66. How did the Orioles draw? I don't know if your book touched on that.
No, it didn't. I imagine they drew very well because it's still a novelty to have a major league team in the first 10, 15 years. But I'd have to go back to Baseball Reference or baseballalmanac.com and look it up. I'm sure they did quite well.
They did not do that well. They did poorly. Surprisingly, with championship teams, in fact, the postseason games were not sellouts.
Oh, wow.
I remember the joke being that the Orioles are gonna have to stage a bad day to sell out a World Series game. You know, and because when the Braves moved to Milwaukee in '53, they were phenomenal. Yeah, $1.8 million, $2 million. So everybody in Baltimore moved the next year. They said, we're gonna beat Milwaukee. And they did. I mean, they drew much better than the Browns did, but they never had the success in Baltimore that the Braves had in Milwaukee.
That's surprising. That's surprising, Bill.
Yeah, they were notorious for this. The good teams they had, they just didn't draw as much as you would have expected. Everybody said, well, is it because Washington is nearby, but then Washington moved and they still didn't draw that much.
Right.
What's interesting is, you know, for the championship series.
Mhm.
I don't think you get both leagues to have sellouts, total sellouts. In the championship series until 1976. In the 8th year, I think there's always games from 69 through 75 that are not sellouts in the championship series. Only in 76. Phillies and the Reds and the Yankees and the Royals.
The Fenway wasn't sold out in 75?
I don't think Oakland was sold out. So.
Right.
And that's the thing. All four, the 76 is the first time that all four teams have sellouts. So it is an interesting thing that, and maybe it has to do with the markets and all that. You know,
Not sure if it makes any difference, but a lot of the games are played in the daytime too.
Yeah.
That could be a difference.
right, by 76, they were playing some games by night.
The Memorial Stadium was not a very good area, not in a very good area.
But a really good deli, Homewood Deli. Yeah.
I remember enjoying Memorial Stadium. I mean, Camden Yards is a different experience, but I think related perhaps to your point, David, in the old days, a lot of the stadiums were in the neighborhood. Yeah, when you mention like, with the Dodgers, we have Tom Zacco, our Dodger fan over there, maybe you'll comment as well. But a lot of the Brooklyn Dodgers lived in Brooklyn, and that was truly a neighborhood as well as a citywide team.
Right. It was a different time in Brooklyn. When I did the book Our Bombs, I talked to many Dodger fans, and they said you could take your kid to the pediatrician and see Pee Wee Reese's wife there with their kid. You could go to the supermarket and see Gil Hodges' wife. Some of these players took the subway.
Yeah.
They parked their car and walked to the ballpark. It was just a different era. It was a different time.
Yeah.
My wife grew up in Flushing, and we were both born in '56. And she was a Mets fan, and she remembers the players who lived in the area.
Yeah.
Jim McAndrew. She remembers those guys. I remember what was it? Art Samsky spoke at a SABR meeting in New York years ago. Yeah. Challengers or something like that.
His restaurant.
And what did he say? He said we were the worst paid world champions of all time.
Yeah.
In all fairness, they're one of the worst world champions of all time too.
They won 100 games.
They did.
They were the best team in the National League.
If you take Seaver, Kuzma, and Adrian Jones off that team, and you got,
Here's the Arizona, they're a great team.
Well, Bill, that's like saying, well, you take Jacqueline Smith, Farrah Fawcett, and Kate Jackson, you don't have Charlie's Angels.
there's only 3 Charlie's Angels. There was 25 New York Mets.
That's like saying you take what's the woman who does guy? Susan Summers, you take her off that show and the show goes nowhere. And it turns out that's correct.
Yeah, there was 2 other girls after her, yeah.
Yeah.
If I may speak to Bill's point, I remember this in terms of the '69 Mets. I remember they had an 11-game winning streak in May and June of that year, and I sensed that they were for real. But I can see Bill's point that team caught lightning in a bottle, and
That's what
it's in terms of like a lot of about baseball simulation. A lot of us are in leagues and stuff like
Right.
that. If the Mets and Orioles played 100 times in simulation and for '69, I really do believe the Orioles would have won a substantial amount of times, whereas the '86 Mets was a far stronger team. There's no comparison really.
Right.
Depends on how you look at it, I guess.
But the fact is, and as we see now, my pet peeve with the playoffs now is that every playoff series in baseball is a stochastic event. It's a random event.
Yeah.
Every series is a random event. Anybody can beat anybody.
Yeah.
In the playoffs. And I think what happened in '69 was, yes, the Mets caught fire, there's no doubt about it, but they won. But they won 100 games. It's not like they won 84 games. They won 100 games.
Not like the 73 Mets.
But the 73 Mets and the '87 Twins are anomalies before the wild card era. That was unusual. Today, it's not unusual anymore. In fact, the commissioner said yesterday, what? We should just expect a team that wins 100 games to go to the World Series? Well, the Luddite in me says that wouldn't be so bad.
All 3 got knocked out in the first round.
It seems like you only get so many wins a year. Don't use them up during the regular season.
Sometimes it's your year.
But it's worse in football when a 9-7 wild card team could legitimately go to the Super Bowl.
Giants did that.
A 9-7 wild card team, it happens. The Giants and the Packers, have they been the 2 that have won at 9 and 7?
Yeah, the Giants did that. Yeah.
I know the Packers.
Right, they beat the 18-0 Patriots.
They beat that does happen. But last year's Super Bowl, I think both teams were the best teams in their conferences, right? I think the Eagles and the Chiefs.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen much in baseball anymore. I mean, when you think about the World Series in the last 10 years, what's the World Series that captured the imagination of everybody?
2016.
Right, absolutely. Right, and why is it? Not only because of the Cubs, it's because both of those teams were really good.
Yeah.
But just to bring this full circle, because I know my time is coming to a close, with 66, you can legitimately say on paper, and we'd have to do a Stratomatic simulation or some other board game simulation to see how the Orioles and Dodgers would match up. But you can legitimately say the Dodgers had the better team statistically on paper, certainly with pitching, but because of intervening factors, because they had to work their starters till the end of the season, because they couldn't clinch, because they were in a three-way pennant race at the beginning, because they were fighting tooth and nail towards the end, and because the Orioles were mentally rested, they were physically rested, they had a couple of weeks to prepare. Those are intervening factors, just like the weather, just like other things that we never take into account because it would take up too much time. And I think that when we look at this, as it was said before, any team has a legitimate chance as long as they're in the hunt. But I don't think anybody, from the people I spoke with, I don't think anybody to a person thought that the Orioles would win 4 out of 4.
Yeah.
Maybe if you told them at the beginning, we know the Dodgers are going to lose, we have a crystal ball, what do you think it's going to be? 4 games to 3, 4 games to 2. Nobody would have considered a sweep. And for the Orioles to win 2 very low scoring games, they won. I mean, the bottom line is they won. If the Giants beat the Eagles 3-0, they still beat the Eagles 3-0. They still won. It might not be to our astonishment. It might not be to our liking, but you are what your record is. It's as simple as that.
But if you did a simulation today, Stratomatic, the Dodgers had Jim Lefebvre at second base, right?
Yep.
He was a 4. Maury Wills is a 2 or 3 at short. Third base, I don't know who the heck they had at third, I forgot. Willie Davis is a 1 in center. The Orioles have who's their second baseman in 66? I forgot.
Dave Johnson.
Probably a 3. They have a 1. They have a 1 at short in that ratio, and a one at third.
Or Blanchard.
No, Blanchard's not there. 1 at third, and Brooks Robinson, and a 1 in center field. Actually, the Orioles have a better defense than the only one for the Dodgers in the infield is Wes Parker, the one position where you don't even need a 1.
I'll just close out my time with a little TV trivia. Jim Lefebvre hits the only home run for the Dodgers in the 66 World Series. You might remember the Brady Bunch and the episode where Bobby Brady dreams that he's a champion of all these different sports. Well, when he dreams about hitting a home run for the Dodgers in a crucial game, they show the film clip of Jim Lefebvre.
Nice. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. You're welcome to stay on for Paul Semendinger, but
Fortunately, I can't, as much as I like and respect Paul. I have a prior commitment, but I do thank you again for the privilege of your time, and I hope to see you at future SABR events, whether virtually or in person.
thank you, Dave.
Take care. Be safe.
Yeah, and you too. Thank you very much. Enjoyed that. So next in the batting order is Paul Semendinger. Are you ready to go, Paul?
Sure. I have a PowerPoint. Let's see if we can share it. Let's see if we can make it work. I'm not actually, you know what? I'm on the wrong computer. So I'll just do it without the PowerPoint. I have 2 computers and actually on the one without PowerPoint. So my book and David, that was great. I'm sorry he left. But he's heard this presentation before anyway. I did it for the Elysian Fields chapter. We're both from New Jersey. And I want to thank you everybody here for inviting me to the Connecticut chapter to talk to you all. And thank you for your understanding, because I was scheduled, I guess it was like in April or May at your last meeting to speak. And the book I wrote is Roy White's autobiography, which I obviously wrote with Roy White. And I'll tell you that whole story. The day that I was going to come see you, there was actually an event at Yankee Stadium for Roy White in a luxury box. And I didn't get to go to all the Roy White book events, but I wanted to make sure I got to that one. And, they wanted me there for that. So I had to graciously ask to decline to be at the Connecticut meeting so I could be at the book event with Roy White at Yankee Stadium. And that was pretty cool. The only time I've ever been in a luxury box at Yankee Stadium. So I'll start off by saying this. I'm the person who's had the good fortune to write Roy White's autobiography. But until I wrote Roy White's autobiography, I didn't know who he was personally. I knew who he was as a Yankee, of course. I've been a Yankee fan since 1977. I think about the Yankees every single day since 1977. I run a Yankee site called Start Spreading the News. If you check it out online, we've been in existence for 6 years. We put out 3 or 4 or 5 articles every single day. We've been doing that nonstop for over 6 years. We've had over 3 million people view the site, et cetera, et cetera. So my life in many regards centers around the Yankees, but I had never known Roy White personally. But I've always believed that in life, we have to think big. We have to, reach for the stars and try things that are impossible. One point in the early 1990s, when I was a school teacher in Fairlawn, I was watching a Yankee telecast and I thought, the Yankees need to have the voice of a common person on their telecast in the booth with Phil Rizzuto, and et cetera. So I wrote a letter to WPIX and said, you ought to consider hiring me to be a voice on the Yankee broadcasts. I never heard back. A few years later, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about Bob Shepard, who was the Yankee PA announcer. And Bob Shepard was getting way up there in years. And boy, oh boy, would I have loved to have his job. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Yankee Stadium. And so I thought, I wonder how one becomes the PA announcer at Yankee Stadium. And I wrote Bob Shepard a long letter. I compared a lot of his life to my life. I was an adjunct college professor, so was he. We both read scripture in church. He was complimented often for obviously his speaking voice, as have I been when I've read in church and done presentations and things like that. And I said, I hope you're the Yankee PA announcer forever. But someday you're going to retire. And when you do, how would I go about applying for your job? And Bob Shepard actually wrote me back. I was amazed. He wrote me a beautiful letter. And he said, Paul, the list of people who are looking to replace me is long, long, long. You might want to reach out to the Yankees. I wish you good luck. So it was a beautiful thing that he even wrote me the letter, but obviously I didn't get that job either. So I've been a writer for a long time. I was a school teacher, and then I was a school principal for a long time. I retired last year after 32 years. Now I'm a college professor, but only an adjunct. I don't work every day anymore. But in my part-time life, when I wasn't teaching and principaling, I write. And as anyone who's ever written knows, it's very hard to get published. And I went to writers' conferences, and I met lots of other people who are involved in writing. And they all said, you need to have a voice. People don't know who you are. You're never going to get published. And the long story is that's how Start Spreading the News got created, my Yankee site, so that I would have a venue and people would get to know who I was. And that led to me having the opportunity to get a number of my books published, like my novel, Scattering the Ashes, my book of inspirational stories, Impossible is an Illusion, my other book about the Yankees, The Least Among Them, which Matt Dahlgren, hi, Matt, good to see you, actually wrote a beautiful complimentary couple of words about in the introduction of the book. So I appreciate that, Matt, as always. And that got me on podcasts, and that got me involved with various other venues. And I got involved with a podcast group called the Northeast Streaming Sports Network. And the guy who runs the network, Mac, was able through a connection to get Roy White to go on to a podcast. And he said, to Paul, to me, you're the Yankee guy. Why don't you interview Roy White for us? And I said, that'd be great. And that was on a Wednesday night, but unfortunately, Roy White had to cancel. So the next day that they were able to schedule was the next Thursday. But that day I had a school event and I couldn't do it. But again, I believe in taking chances and reaching for the stars, and you never know what's going to happen. So I said to Mac, please tell Roy White that I would love to write his autobiography. Now, I didn't think anything was going to come of that. I didn't even know if Mac would even say anything to Roy White. But about a day or two later, I get Roy White's phone number on my phone in a text from Mac. And I'm like, I can't believe it. Now I have Roy White's phone number. Now, I believe in taking big chances, but I don't necessarily believe in calling former Major League Baseball players out of the blue. I wasn't brave enough to just call Roy White. So I texted him and I just said, I was given your number by Mac. You were on the show the other day, and I would love to write your autobiography. And Roy White texted me back and said, thank you so much. We'll get in touch. Took about a month. But a month later, I still hadn't heard back. And so I texted him again right around his birthday at the end of December. And I said, happy birthday. And I'm hoping we can maybe talk about writing that book. He had said, we'll get in touch one day. So I was driving home. This was over the Christmas break. Principals work over the Christmas break. I was driving home and my phone rang and it was Roy White. And I pulled my car to the side of the road so I didn't crash. And I talked to Roy White and I gave him the idea. I said, I understand you've always wanted to have your story written, but all the big time New York writers wanted you to tell all the secrets. He played with Mickey Mantle, played with Reggie, obviously, and Billy Martin and Thurman Munson during those Bronx Zoo years, and George Steinbrenner. And Roy White's too classy to want to do anything like that. And so Roy White said, basically to all those writers, no. So the offer I gave to Roy White was, I will write your story, but it will be your story. I'm not going to ask you to tell specific stories. I'm not going to pry. If you don't want to tell a secret, don't tell the secret. But I think your story is a great story in and of itself, and it needs to be told. It needs to be told. And he listened and he thought about it. And he said, I'll get back to you. About a day or two later, I got a text from Roy White that said, I'm in. Let's do it. And that's how the book came to be. Again, I'd never known him. I'd never talked to him, but I reach for the stars. And sometimes when you reach, you actually grab hold of one. And, I think it was Les Brown says, shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you land among the stars. And on this one, I landed among the stars. So this was in 2022. It wasn't even that long ago. The book just came out this year, Roy White, From Compton to the Bronx. And it tells the wonderful story of Roy White and his great baseball career. He was a Yankee for 15 years, from 1965 to 79. After playing for the Yankees and being a world champion in 1977 and 78 and being an all-star a couple of times, Roy White went and he played baseball in Japan for 3 years with the Yomiuri Giants. Roy White, after that, became a Yankee assistant general manager. He was a Yankee coach on and off. He coached in the Oakland A's system. And he just has a phenomenal long baseball life. And I wanted to tell that story. But when you have a chance to meet somebody and hear their whole life story, the story becomes even richer and greater and deeper. And so I'll just give you a couple highlights from Roy White's life that we cover in the book, and some really remarkable things. Roy White grew up in the late 1940s. He was born and through the 50s. And he grew up in Compton, California, which is, part of Los Angeles. We know it today as an area that's, an inner city, tough place to live. And back when he was growing up, it was an inner city, tough place to live. His neighborhood was right near the Watts neighborhood. And he grew up in a family that had a white dad and a black mom in the 1940s, which was not normal at all. They were decades, if not a century ahead of their time. And unfortunately, their marriage didn't work out. And Roy White ended up living with his mother, but his mother did not have a full-time job. So Roy White and his brother and his sister, they grew up in poverty. there were times in their house when the collection people would come and they'd have to pretend like they weren't home because they couldn't pay their bills. And it was a tough existence. Roy White tells of the stories of friends he knew who got beat up just walking through the streets. And he tells the story of one time he was walking with his friends and a car pulled up and some thugs got out and they had tire irons in their hands and chains, and they started chasing Roy White and his friends. And Roy White ran for his life, as they all did. But as Roy White was running for his life, he saw the Little League field and he ran across the Little League field. But I guess it had recently rained and he slipped on the outfield grass and fell down in the dark on the outfield. And he thought at that moment that somebody was going to beat him up, maybe kill him. Ironically, it was in left field on his Little League field, but they didn't chase him. They must not have seen him run that way, and he didn't get beat up. He thought about it years later playing left field in Yankee Stadium, saying, my goodness, when I was a kid, there was a time I really thought I would die in left field, and now here I am in Yankee Stadium playing left field. Roy White had some difficult things growing up in a tough area, but he never let any of that define him. He didn't let the struggles that went on around him become his reason for not being able to be a success. In addition to growing up in a tough area, he also grew up in an area that was a hotbed for baseball. He grew up with Reggie Smith and all sorts of other guys who played ball with him and around him. And baseball was a big part of his life growing up. And numerous players, Jim Rooker is another one who played in that area, who, they were all familiar with, got drafted. Roy White didn't get drafted because everybody thought he was actually going to go to college. And then there was a Yankee scout, Tuffy Hanshin, who no one's ever heard of, who showed up at Roy White's house and he said, I've been watching you. Now, they knew who the scouts were. He had never seen this guy. But he says, I work for the Yankees and I want to give you a contract. And he gave Roy White a meager contract. Roy White had to think about it. His mom didn't know anything about sports contracts, so he went to his high school baseball coach. He said, everybody's signing for tens of thousands of dollars. The Yankees just offered me like $5,000. Should I take it? And his coach said, yes, you want to play baseball. You're good. Go take it. Go play. And this was 1962. The Yankees are in the World Series all the time. If you make it to the big leagues, you're going to be making tons of money because the Yankees always win. So Roy White signs the contract. He finds out years later that Tuffy Hanshin never even got the Yankees' approval for these contracts. He did work for the Yankees, but he never signed anybody else. And Roy White, I think, is the only one he ever signed who actually made it to the Yankees. He sort of disappears after that, sort of like a magical type of thing. Anyway, Roy White then goes that next year. He's signed actually in that summer, but it's already after spring training. The seasons had already begun. So he becomes property of the Yankees in essence, but he plays amateur baseball, American Legion and things like that the rest of that summer. And he doesn't go to spring training till the next February. And that next February was 1963. And he flies off to Florida. It's the first time he was ever on an airplane. And he shows up in Florida. And this is the deep South in the early 60s. And for the first time in Roy White's life, he faces segregation. So he realizes that in certain parts of the country, he didn't experience this in LA. Like black people and white people couldn't be in the same place. When he gets to his minor league baseball team, his first minor league team after that spring training, the bus pulls up to the hotel and the manager says to two guys, Roy and one other guy, stay on the bus. You can't stay here. As they would go to restaurants, they weren't allowed to eat. Players would have to bring food to them on the bus. All sorts of things like that. And in the batting on deck circle, when his name would be announced, people would yell things at him that were obviously inappropriate and insensitive and mean. Like somebody would say, now batting, Roy White, and people would yell, not really, no, he's not, and things like that. And I asked Roy White, how do you feel about that? How did that make you feel? How do you feel about that even today, all these years later? Are you still angry? And the thing that really struck me and strikes me still about Roy White is his reputation was always as a good, decent, kind human being. And a lot of times when we have the chance to meet our heroes, the heroes of our youth, they turn out to be lesser than we expect. They turn out to be less, they're ego driven, and they're not as good human beings. But Roy White, I have to say, gladly, is as nice and nicer as a human being in person, working with and being with, as his reputation said. Like, he was the classy Yankee. So I asked him, like, how do you feel about segregation? And Roy White said, it wasn't great, but the guys who came before me had it more difficult. Instead of being angry, he praises the people who helped pave the way for him. It's just amazing the way he always finds the good, even in bad situations. So he eventually makes it to the Yankees, 1965. He's not an instant success. His first great year isn't really until like 1968. For a little bit of time, Roy White was sent to the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Yankees loaned Roy White to the Dodgers. He came up as an infielder, came up as a second baseman. They tried him at third base. None of that really worked. And then they finally put him in the outfield, and that's where he stuck. In like 1968, Mickey Mantle's last year, Roy White was the other best player on the Yankees. And amazingly, the Yankees batted Roy White fourth to protect Mantle in the lineup. And then, of course, the 70s come, Thurman Munson comes, Roy White's locker and Thurman Munson's locker end up right next to each other. He tells all sorts of great stories about being teammates with Thurman Munson, obviously. And the Yankees in 1970 came in second place after all those down years, as David was talking about. In 64, they made the World Series. In David's book, 66, the Yankees ended up in last place, right? So Roy White finally makes it to the Yankees, and that's when they're no good. The Horace Clarke era. As for Horace Clarke was Roy White's roommate. And these were not guys that went out and partied and lived the major league life like some of the guys. They would take records, jazz records. One of them would bring a portable record player. The other would bring a few records, and they'd go back to their hotel room and listen to jazz records and just enjoy being cultured. Really good human beings. Anyway, in 1970, the Yankees finish in second place, and they have a champagne party in the locker room. And New York writers didn't like that. They say, oh, how the mighty Yankees have fallen. 73, George Steinbrenner buys the team, and the Yankees start acquiring lots of players, though a couple of them, like Sparky Lyle and Greg Nettles, came before Steinbrenner. But the Yankees' fortunes turn around. He talks about playing in Shea Stadium. Nobody really liked those 2 years when the Yankees played in Shea, most of all, of course, Bobby Mercer. And then Roy White, because the Yankees reopen Yankee Stadium, and Roy White is one of the stars on the 76 Yankees that make the World Series. Yankees get swept by the Reds. But in 77, the Yankees win the World Series. 78, they win the World Series. Roy White talks about his favorite manager who he played for, which was Ralph Houck. And he says Ralph Houck was honest. Ralph Houck, if he told you something, he lived by his word. That was probably the closest he came to saying something negative about anyone, because he answered that question when I asked him how he liked to play for Billy Martin. He didn't feel Billy always treated him fairly. Like in the 1977 World Series, the Yankees played the Dodgers. That's his hometown. And Billy said, Roy, you're going to play regularly. And Roy didn't. He barely played in that 77 World Series. And that really frustrated him and angered him, because not only did he have a chance to play in front of his hometown family and friends in the World Series and against Reggie Smith, who he grew up with, but he didn't get that chance. And he tells how after the Yankees won the World Series, he did not go to the World Series parade that they threw for the Yankees. He was too angry. And that's one of his big regrets, that he missed that. In 78, he plays a lot. There's a new manager, Bob Lemon. And Bob Lemon played Roy White a lot. And before the last game, a lot of the baseball writers are telling Roy, if the Yankees win today, you're probably going to be the World Series MVP. He played that well. But Bucky Dent had a bigger game, and Bucky Dent eventually gets that World Series MVP award. Roy White did not. He didn't want to feel like a hypocrite, like he didn't go the year before, so he didn't go to the World Series parade in 78 either. And again, that's a big regret. Something people don't know about that 78 team also is that when Bucky Dent hit that home run, Mickey Rivers handed him the bat to use, but that bat was a Roy White model. That was Roy White's bat that Bucky Dent hit that home run with. In 1979, Billy Martin's back as the manager. Roy White doesn't play much. And after the season, he's wondering if he's washed up. So he plays in the Dominican League in the winter, and he does great. And he catches the eye of a scout or the owner from the Yomiuri Giants of Japan, and they offer him a contract bigger than he ever received in America. And he said, you know what? That'd be pretty cool to go play in Japan. So for 3 years, he goes and plays in Japan. His first year, the great Sadahara O is on the team. And just like he did in the beginning of his career, Roy White bats fourth behind Sadahara O to protect him in the lineup. And he was part of a world champion team with the Yomiuri. And he really is one of the very few guys ever to win a World Series with the Yomiuri Giants and the New York Yankees, the greatest team on both continents. He's the only guy to be a regular on both teams until someone did it in the reverse. They won a World Series with Yomiuri and then with the Yankees, and that was Hideki Matsui. Gary Thomason was also on the World Series Yomiuri Giant team and the 78 Yankees, but he wasn't a regular at the time. When Roy White gets to Japan, the Japanese treat him with unbelievable respect. The Japanese obviously train differently than the major leaguers in America. And the Japanese players said to Roy White, you don't have to do all the exercises we do. You're a Yankee. You're a world champion. We're just happy you're on the team. But Roy knew that being a teammate meant doing what everybody else on the team does. So he did everything that the other players did. And he loved his 3 years in Japan. After that, he came back home to America. Billy Martin was the manager, and Billy Martin hired Roy White to be one of his coaches. Roy White wanted to still play. He still had that itch. And on that same team was Lou Piniella, who was Roy's teammate. They're about the same age. And he's like, Lou can still play. Why don't you let me play? And Billy just wouldn't let him play. And Roy White tells the story of one day they're playing against the Toronto Blue Jays. He's coaching first base. And Dave Stieb is just mowing everybody down. And he goes, you know, at that moment, I was glad I wasn't playing anymore. So after that, he coaches. He has a great life. He imports artwork from Japan. He has an art studio in Ridgewood, New Jersey. He opens up a sporting goods store for a little while. He owns a racehorse. Really just great stuff. And that's his story. It's, again, what's it called? It's called From Compton to the Bronx. It's the autobiography of Roy White, which then I had the pleasure to also be his writer. So I'm up for any questions. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about Roy White and talk about his great book.
Thank you, Paul. So, Tom, go ahead, please.
Just like a presentation, you were at a Zoom meeting in Baltimore.
I think we lost.
Now, I say it again.
I saw your presentation at a Baltimore Zoom meeting.
Yes, yes.
Right away, I ordered the book right away. I really enjoyed it and I highly recommend it.
Oh, great. That's so nice. Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, now I can see everybody.
Thank you, Bill.
Question about Roy White. His wife passed away recently.
Yes, she did.
You wrote the book. Was she sick at that time, or was she?
Yes. Throughout the whole time that in fact, going back to my story, the reason he had to cancel that first Wednesday when we were going to do the podcast was because his wife was sick and he had to bring her for some treatments. So yeah, probably about a month, little over a month ago that his wife passed.
Thank you.
Mark, can you clarify what you meant by he didn't want to feel like a hypocrite going to parade 78 after passing it up in 77? What you meant by that?
Yeah, he felt like if I didn't go to the parade to be celebrated in 77, I probably shouldn't go to the parade in 78. He was angry in 77 because he felt he hadn't been treated fairly and that Billy Martin didn't tell him the truth. And he just said, he took a principled stand. And, you know, as he said, he regrets that he didn't have that chance. Can you imagine being a world champion and not having the chance to be on that parade in the Canyon of Heroes in New York City? So sometimes we make decisions in life and we think we're making the right decision, but unfortunately,
I guess I'm trying to figure out how that impacts the 78. By then, the anger is long dissipated. It's a different circumstance. They're world champs. I mean, God, you think you'd want to go.
you would. You're right. Right. So sometimes we make decisions and they turn out to be the wrong decisions. And I think he feels like he made the wrong decision, probably both years. But he let anger and get in the way in 77. And then he just didn't feel right then saying, well, I didn't go last year. I shouldn't go this year.
In 77, there was no DH in the World Series. That's why he didn't play. Martin played Pinella, Rivers, and Jackson in the outfield, and White didn't play. 76 and 78, there was a DH, so everybody, the four outfielders can all play, you know.
Correct. Now, Billy Martin had told him that he was going to platoon with Lou Piniella. So I guess Piniella would play against the lefties and White would play against the righties, and that just didn't happen. And that's you know, he felt that Billy didn't tell him the truth. That wasn't that was the reasoning there as to why he was angry in 1977. If your manager tells you you're going to play and then you don't play, obviously it's frustrating.
Well, if I may to add to this, Roy White was always sort of the quiet Yankee, you know, that he didn't talk a lot, and even with the tumult of the Bronx Zoo, you know, yet White put up solid numbers every year, and it's just too bad that Billy didn't play him. But Billy sometimes did strange things, like Billy didn't like Kenny Holtzman for some reason, you know, who could have contributed. But I think also regarding what you said about the rise of the Yankees, I've often maintained that the Yankees were on the rise before Steinbrenner bought the team, and that the moves that put them over the top in the mid-70s were made by Gabe Paul during Steinbrenner's suspension. So I maintain that Steinbrenner doesn't deserve as much credit for the Yankees as people think. And it didn't take any great brains to sign Gossage, Jackson, and Hunter. Actually, Hunter only gave the Yankees one good year during that time. But
Hunter gave the Yankees a couple of good years. And in fact, in 78, when the Yankees made that big comeback, one of the reasons wasn't just Guidry pitching great. It was Catfish Hunter. He had an outstanding second half in 78.
Well, it was a good comeback, but overall, in terms of the contract, which at that time was the big one, Hunter started to fizzle out, and he wasn't that old. But my point is that Gabe Paul made a lot of the trades in the mid-70s that put the Yankees on top when Steinbrenner was suspended. And people conveniently forget that. I mean, the Yankees got Lyle in 72, who was very big. They got Pinella for Lindy McDaniel, who had been previously good. So people forget that. And regarding Horace Clarke, I don't think Clarke was as bad as people make him out to be. It was the rest of the team, the Ross Machitos, Dooley Womacs, Roger Repos, Steve Whitaker, none of whom were of major league caliber. So I think we need to think about that.
Yeah, that's true. It's unfair to Horace Clarke that he gets to be the name of that era. He was a better people than people remember, a better player. I think he's a 2, by the way. You're talking about Stratomatic. I think in his best cards, Horace Clarke is a 2. So he's a pretty darn good fielding second baseman.
You know, the Yankees, people laugh at me. The Yankees of the late 60s. Yeah, they landed on last place in 66. They weren't great in 67. But you know, they weren't horrible. They were not horrible. I mean, I'm not, because you were talking about the Yankees. They landed in last place in 66. They won closest to 7. They won close to 70 games. I know it's 67. They won more. For a last place team, that, you know, I've done studies on it as we right before the second expansion, but the last place team, the 70 wins is a lot of wins in a 10 for a 10-team league. And I know it's the Yankees. Again, we talk about Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle in 67 and 68 could have been, if we look at it today, he should have been the starting first baseman in the All-Star game. He should have been, because his numbers in 68 were better than Killebrew's numbers. And just think, if Mantle had started, Killebrew wouldn't have ripped his groin in the All-Star game.
That's right, yeah.
Just another.
Yes. That's
Yeah,
good.
back then they looked at batting average, and Mantle was not having great batting averages anymore. What did he hit in his last year? 230 something.
But
He walked a lot, yeah, and he still had good power. You know, he still had a good amount of home runs. But this is how the game has changed, right? The way we look at statistics.
He was hurt so much. I mean, obviously he just couldn't play anymore. But his OPS was, for that time in the American League, his OPS was very good. And he is I'm convinced he's the best first baseman in the league. Those 2 years.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Now, when White came up in 1966, he got off to a really hot start the first month or so, and then he faded. Did he say anything about that? You know, did he not adjust? What did he talk about as far as his hot start to fade?
Great point. And then I want to make a point about those Yankee Bronx Zoo years. What's on my mind? Let me just do the Bronx Zoo years. I grew up becoming a Yankee fan in 1977. I just thought that's what baseball is all about. Like, I'm reading newspapers, I'm just starting to understand the game, and this one's fighting with that one, and Reggie fights with Thurman, and Thurman fights with Billy Martin, and Billy Martin's fighting with George Steinbrenner. But as I look at it now, all these years later, one of the nice things that I was able to do in the book was I have little vignettes from other Yankees. Willie Randolph has a piece in the book. Chris Chambliss has a piece in the book. And Willie Randolph says when he came to the Yankees, he came full of, fire, and, he's all, I can't think of the word I'm trying to say, but vim and vigor or whatever, right? And then he saw the way Roy White composed himself. And he said, you know what? That guy is so classy. That guy handles everything. He doesn't get upset. He takes every day by his day. He's a professional. He works hard. He does what he's supposed to do. And Willie Randolph says that he modeled the way he comported himself on the field after the way he saw Roy White handle himself on the field. And as I look back on those teams, Guidry, Randolph, Chambliss, Roy White, those guys were sort of the core, the calm that was underneath all that tumult. And I don't believe the Yankees would have been successful if they didn't have those elements of calm to bounce off or to calm down some of the other crazy stuff that was going on between the other players, as it was reported in the newspapers and stuff. And I think a lot of credit for that goes to Roy White. But to go back to that question of when he had that great start to the year, Roy White's very depreciating. He's not a type of person who brags about himself. He talks about himself in like I said, a self-depreciating type of way. And he got off to that great start. He was hitting a bunch of home runs and he was really doing well. And he said, you know what? I then started to think that I was going to be a home run hitter, and I'm not. And I don't think I hit another home run after like May 15th. He started to swing for the fences. And back then they didn't have batting coaches. They just had your regular coaches and your teammates, and people would just say, yeah, you'll figure it out. You'll get it. There wasn't a whole lot of instruction that went on. And so he had to then figure out what he did wrong. And what he realized was he shouldn't be swinging to hit the ball out. And that's why he started to choke up on the bat when he batted, because he said, I needed to always remind myself that I was not a home run hitter. And I was better when I used the whole field and I used my speed and things like that to make myself better and make myself a complete player. He also talked in the book, and it's in the book, but we talked about it, is how he remembers watching Mickey Mantle in that 68 season before a doubleheader with only a couple games left in the year, get taped up every game, every day before every game. And it was a doubleheader against the Tigers. And he saw Mickey getting taped up and he's in total pain. And then on a ground ball, Mickey ran as hard as anybody could to break up what would have been a double play. And at that point, Roy White, watching Mickey Mantle, said, if he is playing that hard, I have no excuse for never giving my best. That's Mickey Mantle when he could have mailed it in at the end of the year when the Yankees were already out of it. And he's still playing as hard as he can. And that left an indelible impression on Roy White.
Well, could you comment further on, like in your writing about Roy White, White's personal life, because he was always very quiet. So I'm wondering what you found out. What kind of interest did he have? His family life. You mentioned jazz before. I'm also glad you mentioned Willie Randolph, whom I've always felt was very underrated. You know, and he was an important part of those teams. And he has an interesting birthday, 7654. I'm a numbers guy, as a lot of you will know. So I like stuff like that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So one of the things I did when I wrote the book was I would ask him guiding questions, but I never wanted him to think that I was a fan. I was a writer. I am, but I wasn't doing this to be a fan. So I would ask him guiding questions, but I would never pry. I never like say, tell me more. And if there was an area where I could sense that he didn't want to share it, he had a wonderful wife for, 50 years. They had been married for such a long time, a loving, dedicated relationship between the two. He has 2 kids. There's great stories about both of them. I'll tell that real quickly. His daughter was born in 1968, I believe. And it was right as the season begins. And it's back then you didn't get paternity leave. Players didn't leave the team to go be with their wives when their babies were born. So he didn't get a chance to even see his wife and daughter until she was a couple of weeks old. And the Yankees flew out to California. And he was not playing regularly at the time. And she was fussy at night. And so he said to his wife, look, I'm here. I'll stay up all night with her and you get some rest. I'm not playing tomorrow anyway. Turns out the next day, Roy White was in the lineup. And from that moment on is when his career really blossomed. And it really was after staying up all night with his infant daughter. Years later, when they're in Japan, obviously the kids are now in school, so they couldn't come in February to Japan with him. He had to live by himself until the end of the school year. And when his son gets out to Japan with the rest of his family, his son says, I want to go to a game. I want to see what it's like for you to watch my daddy play in Japan. And Roy White he started off great but then went into a big slump in that year too, until the day his son comes to the ballpark with him and he hits 3 home runs. I think 2 right-handed and 1 left-handed. And he really thinks that he's going to be the big star in the paper. And he's telling his son, like, we're going to be on the headlines. But Sadahara O also homered that day. And Sadahara O got all the headlines. But his Japanese career turned around when his son came. The other things that he loved to do, he loved listening to music. He loves artwork, especially Japanese art. As I said, he started importing and selling it for numerous years. He loves his friends. He talks to them all the time and values all those friendships. He's always been a big reader as well. I talked to Ray Negron, who, was the famous Yankee bat boy who then became a Yankee executive for all those years. And he talks about how Roy White always would have a book. And Ian Dixon, who no one's heard of, who was one of his minor league teammates, always talked about how Roy was always reading, which isn't necessarily common even today in baseball players. So that's sort of who Roy White is outside of the ballpark.
When you wrote, did you like write and then ask him to review it and make comments? Or and if so, what kind of comments did he make? Was there anything he wanted out, or you sort of wish he did put out? How did that process work between you?
Yeah, so the process was great. I live in Wyckoff, New Jersey. Roy White lives in Upper Saddle River, New Jersey. We're not far from each other. And he originally we started doing it by Zoom, really Google Meets, but the technology wasn't great. And he said to me, let's meet in person. And in Bergen County, New Jersey, the place he suggested was the mall, Paramus Park Mall, but it's closed on Sundays. And the first day that we had an availability to meet together was on a Sunday. So I said, I don't think we can meet in the food court there because it's closed. But there's some restaurants in Ramsey, New Jersey, where we could meet. There's a Five Guys, there's a great pizza parlor, there's a Panera Bread. And he said, let's write it at Panera Bread. I'll meet you there. And so there's a Panera Bread in Ramsey, New Jersey on Route 17 North in Ramsey Square. And that's where I met Roy White a couple of times a month on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon. I'd bring my computer. He'd sit down. I'd sit down, and we'd just start talking baseball. And then as he talked, I typed. People said, "Did you tape it? Did you tape any of the conversations?" I didn't. I just wrote down what he said as we talked, and then I would send him the drafts of what I wrote. And there was only one time in the back of the book, I wanted to sort of add a couple of things. So I made an appendix, and one of the appendixes called "What Made Roy White Successful." Originally, I had written that as the appendix, "What Made Me Successful." And when Roy White read it, he liked it. And then he got back to me a couple of days later and he goes, "It's good, but I don't talk about myself. That's not who I am. I wouldn't call myself successful, and I wouldn't say all that. So I'm kind of uncomfortable with that part." And I went, I liked what I wrote. So I said, I'll tell you what, can I rewrite that all and just have it be me? Instead of "What Made Me Successful" by Roy White, it's "What Made Roy White Successful" by Paul Semendinger. And he goes, "Yeah, you could do that." And so that was the only real edit that he had. The only real thing that he didn't, that I had written, that he had sort of said, I'm uncomfortable with that. The rest of it, he was happy with. It was really a smooth process.
Good. Other questions? Anybody else? Okay, Gary, good.
Are you thinking about a new project now?
Yes, I always have new projects. I have a novel I'm working on, but my big project I'm working on now is there's only one guy who has a tie to baseball in the whole book. And that guy's name is Abner Doubleday, because my book, the big project I'm working on right now, is a book about the Battle of Gettysburg, believe it or not. And Abner Doubleday fought at Gettysburg. You know, obviously, people don't know that he was one of the generals who fought heroically on the first day's battle as the Confederates were, coming down onto the town of Gettysburg. So I'm writing about a lot of Yankees, but they're not the New York Yankees.
That's good. All right, good. Anybody else? All right, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I apologize.
At the Zoom meeting, you said you wanted to write a book on Frank Howard, but he didn't want a book written on him.
I say that again.
So you contacted Frank Howard about writing a book?
No, I never contacted. No, Roy White was the one who didn't. I never contacted Frank Howard.
Okay, somebody else at the Zoom meeting, and sorry. Okay.
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay, any other questions?
So let me just say thank you to everybody. And Matt, you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to say, Paul, it's nice to finally see you. I like, as you said, I was fortunate enough and thrilled to write a little blurb for your book, The Least Among Them, which I loved.
Thank you.
So it's nice to actually see you. And I want to make a comment, really. I love your tenacity and your reach for the stars philosophy and attitude. And I'm going to tie that into something that my grandfather always taught me and all of us grandkids. He was and I'll get into this momentarily, but he was a really great defensive first baseman. And his standpoint was any good fielder has to make their own hops. You can't let the ball play you. You got to make your own hops. And he tied that in with his philosophy in life, that in life, you have to make your own hops. If you want something in life, you got to go out and get it. And I thought of that as I listened to you talking about writing to Bob Shepard and just always trying to make your own breaks. You know what I'm saying? And I thought of my grandfather when you were saying that, because he would he would really he would appreciate that style of that philosophy you have. I'll just say that. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
that
And
was
by the way,
really neat.
Matt Dahlgren's book is phenomenal. About his grandfather, Babe Dahlgren. It's just a page turner. Every single word, you just get so wrapped up in. And Matt, the other thing about your book is it just leaves like this sense of sadness that he could have been so much more. All right, and you're getting into this in your presentation, I'm sure, if not for some unfair rumors about him.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
It's awesome that you felt the desire and have the ability to have been able to tell your dad's story, because everybody knows Babe Dahlgren was the guy who replaced Lou Gehrig, but then the rest of his story nobody really knows, and his story also needed to be told, and you tell it extremely well.
Well, thank you.
And Paul, thank you very much, and that's a great segue to hearing from Matt Dahlgren, whom I heard about through Bruce McClure, the leader of the Northern New England chapter. So, Matt, welcome to the wilds of Connecticut, and we look forward to your telling us about Babe Dahlgren. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today and inviting me to speak. To be honest, it's been a while since I've done presentations for my book, Rumor in Town. The book was published back in 2007 and had a good run for a few years back then. And then it wasn't until recently that I had the opportunity to speak for Bruce's chapter and now this chapter here. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak about my book and my grandfather. So I just want to give a little background on why I wrote the book and how it all came about. I grew up I'm coming to you from the state of Washington, where I've lived the past 7 years. But before that, I was born and raised in Southern California, Irvine, California. And I lived about 40 minutes away from my grandparents, who lived in Bradbury, California, which was at the base of the San Gabriel Mountains. So as a kid growing up, all throughout my childhood and even young adulthood, I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, be it on school breaks, summer vacations, just weekends, what have you. My family spent a lot of time with him, and I would go up extra and spend weeks at a time with him and just help him around the house. He had a couple of acres of land and a big pool, and so I'd help him out and just kind of shadow him wherever he went and ask questions and listen. I was a sponge. I would just soak up all of his stories. And one thing I realized is, especially the older I got, is how he had, aside from replacing Lou Gehrig, which I'll get into, he had a story, a more pressing story that he wanted to tell and get off of his chest. And so he sat down in the 80s and started writing his own book, a memoir, if you will, that he wanted to publish to tell his story. And in the 70s, he started writing that. And then in 1980, his home burned to the ground. There was a Southern California fire that took about 70 houses. His was one of them. Burned it to the ground. He lost everything. Everything. The only thing left standing was the fireplace. So you can imagine, 18 years of professional memorabilia gone. All the memories that he and my grandmother had with photos and things gone, but also was his manuscript that he was working on. So during the 80s, he rebuilt his home and started writing again, and he really wanted to get the story off of his chest. And when he passed away in 1996, he, on his desk in his office, was this binder, which was his manuscript. And knowing how much he wanted to tell his story, I took the binder. I went up there after he passed away just by myself, and I walked through his home and was just kind of recollecting things and just having a moment just in their home by myself. And I took the binder from his desk and I just held on to it. And I thought to myself, at some point, I'm going to write his story for him. I made a promise to him to do that. And so a few years went by, and I got the itch to start doing some additional research and going to the UCI library back in Irvine, California, and started searching old microfilm just to get some stories and some old things and what have you, my ducks in a row. And I started the writing process. I wasn't a writer. I'd never written anything before. But I had to do this for my grandfather. So started writing, and after a few years of writing, I was proud to actually have the finished book Rumor in Town, which is available at rumorintown.com. And there's a lot of information and quotes and photos and things like that at rumorintown.com. So I just would love for you to stop by and take a look at it. I'll try to just sum up, talk about Babe's early life real quick, and then I'll get to the pressing story at hand. Babe was born in 1912 in San Francisco. Grew up. He lost his father at the age of 3. And he had an older brother, and it was Babe and his older brother. They had an infant brother that also died at a very early age. And life was hard for Babe and his brother and his mother. She eventually remarried, and this man had a love for baseball and was a kind of a rough guy, drank too much, his stepfather. But on one particular day, when Babe was around 8 years old, the stepfather took him to a game, a Pacific Coast League game, a San Francisco Seals game at Old Recreation Park. And Babe was watching these guys playing baseball on a weekend, and they had nice colorful flannel uniforms on, and he was sitting out in the stands, the bleachers, eating warm peanuts and drinking soda pop. And after the first game, the guys ran off the field, and the stepfather said, you know, Babe, they're going to go change, put dry undershirt on, and come back out and play a second game. And Babe, 8 years old, sitting there in the stands, was confused. He said to his stepdad, he said, well, if all these guys do is play baseball all day, what do they do for work? How do they have time to work? And his stepfather told him, this is their work. They get paid to do this. And right there, he had this epiphany, watching a Pacific Coast League game, that's what I want to do in my life. I want to be a baseball player. And so from that point on, he just started, doing whatever he could to stay involved in the game. And as he matured and got into his teenage years, was on Sandlot team. Back then there were semi-pro teams. And frankly, you go back in the old San Francisco newspapers and you'd see the box scores of these semi-pro teams. It's fascinating. So he started playing baseball as much as he could, played through high school, played other sports as well. And then it was after high school, he was playing in a semi-pro team, a pro league game, and was signed by the San Francisco Mission Reds of the Pacific Coast League. And that was in 1931. And his professional career gets going in 1931. They farmed him out to Tucson, which was a Class D low minor league level back then. In 1931, starts playing for the Tucson Cowboys, and then midseason, the San Francisco Missions call him back up. So from 1931 to the end of 1934, he didn't miss a game with the Missions. He played in 621 consecutive games. Ironically, a lot of the papers were calling him, Iron Man and things like that. And the irony is of what was to come with Babe and the actual Iron Man. So he's the Red Sox buy his contract at the end of 1934, and in all of 1935, Babe's the starting first baseman for the Boston Red Sox. And at the end of the 35 season, going into spring training in 36, the Red Sox trade for Jimmy Fox, which leaves Babe thinking, okay, well, what does that mean for me? So for the 36 season, the Red Sox send Babe down to Syracuse, plays down there, has a great year at Syracuse, is an all-star down there. The Red Sox call him back up at the end of the 36 season, plays with the Red Sox for about a month. That season ends, and now we get to 37. And Babe, back home in San Francisco, gets wind of the fact that he's just been sold to the New York Yankees. He's thinking, my God, like, first Jimmy Fox takes a job from me. Now I got to go to the Yankees. They have Gehrig. I mean, he's thinking, I'm never going to get a shot to play. The reason why the Yankees bought Babe was because in 37, before spring training, Gehrig was threatening to hold out, wanting more money, and the Yankees wanted some insurance in the event that he did. So they signed Babe. Babe reports to spring training in 1937. Gehrig signs. Gehrig shows up to spring training. The season starts in the second week of May. The Yankees ship Babe down to the Newark Bears, the 1937 Newark Bears. And McCarthy told Babe, I want you to go to Newark and I want you to play third base because you're too young to sit the bench up here. I want you to play third base, learn how to play in other positions so that, eventually we can bring you back up as a utility player. So Babe goes to Newark in 37, hits cleanup for that Bears team, which is to this day known as one of the greatest minor league teams of all time. That team was loaded with future stars like Joe Gordon, Charlie Keller, Spud Chandler, Marius Russo, Atlee Donald, a lot of future major league all-stars. That 37 Bears team goes on. They win like 109 games that year. They won the International League by 25 and a half games, and ended up winning the Little World Series as well. In 1938, the Yankees call him back up, and now he's a utility player in all of 1938 for the Yankees. Gets a few at bats that year, comes in late innings to replace Gehrig in a game for defense or what have you. But for the most part, he spent the entire year on the bench. In 1939, he's thinking the same thing is going to happen. I mean, I'm going to be on the Yankees, but I'm going to just be a role player, a utility player. And they get to spring training in 1939, and everyone started noticing that something seemed off with Lou. He wasn't moving like himself. He was a little more sluggish, a little slower. The writers were picking up on this. If you go back and read some of the old papers from the spring of 1939, the writers were even talking about it. But everyone thought that, okay, it's just age, and that, once the team moves up to north to Yankee Stadium to start the season, Lou will shake off the rust and things will get back to normal. But there were a couple incidents in spring training that Babe witnessed and thought that something just seems really off here. One particular one was they were playing in an exhibition game, and there was a pop-up where Gehrig came running in towards the first base dugout for a pop foul, and he ran over and he got to the ball, but the ball dropped right in front of him, a catch that he normally would have made. And he leaned down to pick up the ball, and he had a hard time straightening up after the fact. Babe saw that and thought that seemed odd. There was another incident where they were playing the Dodgers in a spring training game, and Lou hit a shot to right center to the fence, and what normally would have been a triple for Gehrig. And everyone looked up. They were looking out to the right fielder picking up the ball, and then when they looked back into the infield, Gehrig was laboring just to get to second base. And everyone thought that's really odd. And so no one said anything, but people were starting to see things. And so the season starts, and Lou plays the first 8 games of the year for the Yankees, and is not himself, and he's hitting about a 140 or something like that. And there was an off day on May 1st, and the Yankees were traveling to Detroit. And on May 2nd, in the clubhouse at Detroit before the game, Babe's sitting on the stool in front of his locker getting dressed, and he was fiddling with his glove, just tying the laces on a glove. And he got a tap on his shoulder, and it was Art Fletcher, who was a coach for the Yankees. Art Fletcher leaned in and got really close to Babe's face, and he said, almost in a whisper, he said, "You're playing first base today." And Babe looked up at him like, "Are you kidding me?" And Art Fletcher just gave him a deadpan look and said, "No, you're in there today." And Art walked away, and he looked over his shoulder, and he turned back and looked at Babe, and he said, "Good luck today, Babe." And Babe had this moment where he's sitting in front of his locker, and he's stunned. Lou Gehrig had been Babe's boyhood idol when Babe was a kid in San Francisco, and now here he is being told that he's going to replace him and the streak's going to end. And so the team walks out to the field to take batting practice, and the word's starting to get out that that's happening. And photographers are running up and wanting pictures of Gehrig and pictures of Babe and the two of them together. And Babe's just in shock. He can't believe this. And it was before the game. There's a very poignant photo of Gehrig with his arm around Babe. Their feet are up on the steps of the dugout looking out. Someone from behind took the picture, I know it was when there was a point before the game where Babe went up to Lou and said, "Lou, you've put me in a horrible spot here. Like I can't, you got to keep your streak going. I don't want to do this." It's the one day in Babe's life he said he didn't want to play baseball, was that day. He wanted to see Gehrig's streak continue. And Lou said, "You're going to do fine today, Babe. Go out there and knock in some runs." And so Gehrig took the lineup card up to home plate, delivered the lineup. And when Gehrig walked back to the dugout, he walked straight to a drinking fountain in the dugout, and he was down getting a drink for the longest time. And Babe happened to be really close to the drinking fountain at the time, and so was Johnny Murphy, a relief pitcher. And Babe and Murphy looked at each other, and they looked at Gehrig, and they realized he was down in the fountain for the longest time because he was crying. Gehrig was crying. And they didn't know what to say. They didn't want Gehrig to see them looking at him. And Murphy picked up a towel off the back of the dugout and he just threw it over at Gehrig, and it landed on Gehrig's shoulders. And Gehrig came up from the drinking fountain and wiped his face off with the towel. And everyone pretended like they didn't see that he was crying. And the game got underway. And the Yankees went out that day and just took it to the Tigers. They beat the Tigers 22-2. Babe hit a home run and a double, and had a phenomenal day at the bat himself, and went to Gehrig throughout the game, late in the game, the 6th inning, the 7th inning, the 8th inning. The Yankees were up by a ton of runs. He said, "Lou, get out there, keep your streak going, keep it going." And Gehrig said, "No, you're doing fine, Babe. You're doing just fine." And so that was it. I mean, the streak ended, as everyone knows, it ended on that day. And everyone thought, okay, Gehrig's going to take a rest and maybe sit out a day or two and rest his legs a little bit, but that he'll be back. And with every passing day, Babe's name was written in the lineup, and Gehrig just sat there stoically on the bench and cheered him on, but he never returned. And then it was in June 12th, the Yankees played an exhibition game against Kansas City, their minor league affiliate. They played an exhibition game in Kansas City. Gehrig actually played in that game. He played an inning, I think, or two. He started that day. So many people think that Gehrig never played again after May 2nd. He never played in a big league game, but he appeared in that exhibition game. After that game, Gehrig flew up to Minnesota to go to the Mayo Clinic, and the Yankees went back home to New York. And it was a couple of weeks later that Gehrig returned to the Yankees in late June with the news of his disease, and the fate was cast, and he had a letter from the doctor saying that he was never going to play again, and the rest is history. So the Yankees went on to just steamroll the American League that year in 1939. They won the pennant, they won the World Series, they swept the Reds in 4 games. Babe hit a home run in that World Series in Game 2. And he was, starting to feel like, okay, he belonged as a Yankee, that he was a Yankee now. And he goes home in the offseason of 39-40, goes to spring training in 1940, leads the Yankees in home runs in spring training in 1940. The season starts. The Yankees just, for whatever reason, they're not clicking that year. They're just not. They're not the powerhouse that they had been the previous 4 years, and they don't win the American League by 2 games. And there was a couple of plays late in the year where Babe made a couple of errors late in the season that Joe McCarthy publicly essentially blamed the pennant on Babe for making those 2 errors late in the season, which was a pretty unfair thing to do. Going into right before the 1941 spring training was to start, Babe catches word back in San Francisco that he'd been sold to the Boston Braves, which shocked him, not only him, but all the writers in New York. I mean, everyone was shocked at that. Babe goes to Boston, and after about 44 games with them, he's leading the team in home runs. He's sold to the Cubs. And so this is where things start to get a little bit haywire for Babe. So he's thinking, okay, I'm with the Braves, I'm doing well, and all of a sudden they sell me to the Cubs. He goes to the Cubs in 1941, mid-season, ends up hitting 16 home runs for them, finishes the year with 23 home runs in 1941, the most for any right-handed hitter in the National League. And he's feeling, okay, at least I found a home in Chicago. And the Cubs give him a raise before the 42 season. They give him $1,000 raise. He goes to spring training in 1942, and the season starts in 1942, and he's seen limited time. He's playing a little bit, then not playing, going stretches of days not playing, and he's thinking, what's going on here? So he goes up to Jimmy Wilson, the Cubs manager, and he says, hey, what's wrong with me? What's going on? And Jimmy Wilson says, I don't know, Babe, what is? And the way Wilson answered that question, that I don't know what is, it had Babe thinking, like, what is he talking about? Babe was confused by that answer. And then about a few weeks later, the Cubs sell Babe to the Dodgers. Now here's Babe thinking, what do I got to do? I mean, I led the National League in home runs by right-handed hitters the previous year. They give me a raise. Now they're selling me. The Dodgers had Dolph Camilli, so there was really no need for the Dodgers to take Babe on. Dolph Camilli was the MVP the previous year in the National League. So Babe goes to Brooklyn and is sitting the bench in Brooklyn. And in August of 1942, the Brooklyn Dodgers tell Babe, we're sending you down to Montreal. You and Schoolboy Rowe, we're sending you down to Montreal. And Babe said, no way. I'm not going to Montreal. I'm an established major leaguer. I've been on World Series teams. I'm not going to Montreal. And they said, well, we're sending you to Montreal. And Babe said, I'm not going. So Babe he quit. He drove home. And on his way home, he stopped in Chicago to see Judge Landis. And he wanted to express a grievance with Landis, saying that this isn't right, that I'm being sent to Montreal. And I'm not going to take that. I'm not going to take that assignment. And Landis said, listen, I understand you're frustrated. He said, go home and give it some thought. But before you officially retire from the game, I want you to write me a letter and state to me that you are actually officially retiring from baseball. Babe said, okay. So Babe went home to California, started working odd jobs to make some money. And before the 43 season started, Branch Rickey had come over from the Cardinals to now be the president and general manager of the Dodgers. Larry McPhail left the Dodgers to enlist in the Army, and the Dodgers brought on Branch Rickey to take McPhail's spot. And one of Ricky's first things that he did was offer Babe to the Indianapolis Ball Club of the American Association League for $5,000. And to Landis's credit, Landis told Rickey, you can't offer Babe for $5,000 unless you offer him to all the major league clubs for that amount first. And that ticked Rickey off, because Rickey was thinking that, he just didn't like to be steamrolled like that. And so Rickey offered Babe a contract for $5,500, $500 on top of the $5,000 that he offered him to the minor leagues. And he said, Rickey told Babe, I'm going to be in Los Angeles in February, and we can meet and talk about your contract. So Babe met Branch Rickey at the Lancashire Hotel in February of 1943. And in that meeting, things were getting contentious about money and the contract and what have you. I mean, the year before, Babe was making $11,000, and he's now down to $5,500. And so Rickey in that meeting said, Babe, can I ask you a question? And Babe said, sure. It was just the two of them in the meeting. And he said, sure, what's the question? And Branch Rickey said, you promise you won't get mad at me? And Babe said, well, I'm not going to promise anything. I don't know what the question is. What's the question? And he says, do you smoke marijuana? And Babe looked at him with a pretty ticked off look on his face, and he says, what are you talking about? Do I smoke marijuana? And he says, that's a hell of a thing to say about a guy. And Rickey said, look, I said, don't get mad. And Babe said, well, of course I'm mad. And Babe at the time, like a lot of players, smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes. And he took a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, his coat pocket, and literally threw them across the room at Branch Rickey and said, have those analyzed if you think I smoke marijuana. And Babe stormed out of the meeting. Okay. Now, so about a week later, a couple weeks later, Babe finds out that the Dodgers have traded him to the Phillies, which Babe was happy. He wanted to get out of there. So he's traded to the Phillies. In 1943, Babe gets off to a red hot start with the Phillies. In as late as June, is leading the National League in hitting. And one day in New York, they're on the road, and he and his roommate Danny Litweiler are in the lobby of the New Yorker hotel, and they see Charlie Dressen in the lobby, Chuck Dressen, and they go over to say hi to Chuck Dressen, ask him how he's doing. And Dressen tells Babe and Litweiler that he had just come downstairs from a meeting with Branch Rickey and some other Dodger executives, and that in the meeting, the executives were kind of grilling Rickey as to why the Dodgers would have traded you, Babe, because here you are leading the National League in hitting now, and the Dodgers traded you. And Dressen went on to say that in the meeting, Rickey told the executives that he traded you because you smoke marijuana. And Danny Litweiler, Babe's roommate, said, well, that's a hell of a thing to say about Babe. He says, I couldn't be further from the truth. He said, I'm with Babe all the time, 24/7 on the road. And I've never seen Babe do that. And Babe said, yeah, you know, Rickey mentioned that to me in a contract meeting. And so Babe said, this isn't the first time I've heard this, but he says, I don't know why Rickey keeps spreading this about me. And so in Babe's mind, he's now thinking, I've got to stop this. I've got to put an end to this rumor. So they continue playing, and about a couple of weeks go by, and there's a day where Babe's on the training table. The Phillies are in St. Louis now playing the Cardinals, and Babe's on the training table getting some work done by the Phillies trainer. That year, the Phillies had hired an old track coach by the name of Harold Anson Bruce. He was an Olympic track coach, and the Phillies had hired him to come in and be kind of a physical personal trainer. It was very cutting edge for a major league team to do this at the time. This guy, Harold Anson Bruce, walked into the training room in St. Louis when Babe was getting some work done, and he said, Babe, can I talk to you for a second? And he said, sure, Harold. And then Harold asked the trainer if he would leave the room. And so the trainer left the room, and now it's Babe and Harold Anson Bruce, the physical conditioning coach. He said, Babe, you know, when I was hired by the Phillies, I didn't know much about baseball. He said, I came here, I have a track background, as you know. And he goes, so when the Phillies brought me on, I started studying veterans on the team. And one of the veterans I studied was you. I wanted to see how a veteran acted in baseball, what you did, how you handled yourself on and off the field. I wanted to learn the game. And he said, and that's why when I'm hearing about you right now, it's bothering me, and I want to come talk to you about it. And Babe's laying there on the training table, said, what are you hearing? And he says, I'm hearing that you smoke marijuana. And laying on the training table at Sportsman's Park in St. Louis, Babe started to shed a tear. He started to cry because he's thinking, this is out now, and it's catching, it's like a fire. It's just spreading, and he has no idea who started this, why it started, but he's thinking now how it's going to damage and potentially ruin his career, because it's not like today where this is accepted in many circles. I mean, this is 1943, and if you were considered to be a marijuana smoker on a Major League Baseball team, you were no good. They did not want you there. So Babe got up off the training table, and he went out and he saw Bucky Harris, the manager of the Phillies. He said, Bucky, I got a problem. He says, I need to see the commissioner. And Bucky Harris said, what is it? He goes, there's some things being said about me, and I want them put to an end. And Bucky Harris said, what, the marijuana stuff? And Babe looked at Bucky Harris and he said, you knew about this? And he said, well, yeah, I knew about it. He says, when Rickey traded you to the Phillies, he had mentioned it to the new Phillies owner, Bill Cox. And Bill Cox didn't believe it, and he said, you know, I'll take Babe. I've never heard that. So the trade happened, but the fact is that they did hear about it. And Bucky Harris told Babe, if you want to see the commissioner when we're in Chicago next time, sure, go ahead. So the next time the Phillies were in Chicago, Babe made it a point and he walked into Landis's office, downtown Chicago. And Landis said, what can I do for you today? And Babe says, there's some things being said about me that I would really like them stopped. And I don't know why they're being said, but I'll do whatever I got to do to prove that it's not true. And Landis said, well, what's being said about you? Babe said that I'm a marijuana smoker, and I'm not. I've never smoked marijuana in my life. I'll take whatever test I have to. So Landis said, okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to take you to a doctor in Chicago, and we'll go right now. Imagine this. This is in 1943, in the middle of the season in 1943. The Philadelphia Phillies first baseman, Babe Dahlgren, and the commissioner of baseball are walking through the city of Chicago to a doctor's office. And Landis goes in and takes him and introduces him to a doctor in town and says, this is Babe Dahlgren. He plays for the Philadelphia Phillies. Landis explained the whole thing to the doctor. And the doctor said, I'll tell you what, he says, to do this right, he's going to need a doctor back in Philadelphia, his home city, to give him a series of tests on a regular basis that would show whether or not he is using marijuana. And the doctor referred Babe to a doctor in Philadelphia. And Babe said, okay. And Landis told Babe, I want you to send me all of the medical bills from the doctor in Philadelphia. Major League Baseball will pay for this. He goes, but I don't want you talking about this to anybody. So he told that to Babe. And Babe said, okay. So Babe went to this doctor in Philadelphia, series of tests. Everything came back negative, as he knew it would. And he would send Landis the bills. And every time Babe heard another player or another coach mention the rumor, Babe would tell Landis, hey, I heard it again. I heard it again. And so pretty soon the list was growing of people that had heard the rumor. And the 43 season comes to an end. At the end of the season, the Phillies bring on new ownership. Bill Cox got into some problems of his own, the new Phillies owner, some gambling issues. And so there was new ownership with the Phillies. Some new ownership comes in who had ties with Branch Rickey in the past, some of the men involved. And Babe's traded again from the Phillies to the Pirates. And he was an all-star with the Phillies. So I go figure, they're trading their all-star first baseman to the Pittsburgh Pirates and getting nothing in return. Babe goes to Pittsburgh, continues to hear people coming up and asking him about the rumor. Landis dies in 1944. Happy Chandler comes on, and Babe's thinking, oh my God, my whole thing just is gone now. I mean, my one advocate, Judge Landis, is now dead. And now what am I going to do? So Babe writes to Happy Chandler, explains to Happy Chandler everything that's going on. And Happy Chandler tells him, hey, I'll look into it. Let me see what I can do. Nothing happens. Babe plays for the Pirates in 1944. Then in 1945, in 1946, L.B. Fletcher comes back. Pirates first baseman comes back from the Navy, and the Pirates send Babe. They trade Babe to the St. Louis Browns in 1946. The first week of the season, he dives for a ball in Comiskey Park on a frozen infield at Comiskey, and he separates his shoulder and tears some ligaments in his shoulder. And he's never the same after that. Plays periodically later in the season in 1946, but his shoulder was killing him all year, and that was it. And at the end of 46, the Browns released him, and he was out of the big leagues. He tried to come back in 47. He thought, I'm going to try to come back. Plays with the Baltimore Orioles in the International League. Has a good year with them in 1947. But at the end of that season, no major league teams wanted him. He goes back home to California, and the Sacramento, the Pacific Coast League in 1948, signs Babe. Plays in 1948 with Sacramento. Has a good year with them. And then at the end of that year, the writing was on the wall. No major league teams wanted him back, and that was the end of his playing career. So he got, after he retired, he raised two young boys. He and my grandmother raised two young boys, and he spent a lot of time with them. And in the late 50s, he had a couple of scouting jobs with the Kansas City Athletics and also the Baltimore Orioles. And then he got into coaching, and that's a whole separate story that I won't waste too much time with right now, though I think it's very relevant. Babe was the first person to ever bring film into Major League Baseball as a device for instruction. And he did that in 1964 with the Kansas City Athletics. But he lived the last half of his life wanting to tell his story about this rumor and why he felt it started. He spent a lot of time in his older years wondering why would somebody say this about me? How could they do this? And he kind of came to a conclusion of where it started. And I talked about that in the book. But it was very important for me once he passed away to take his book, his binder, and turn that into a book, which is what Rumor in Town is. So I can get pretty long-winded, and I'll just cut it off right there. But if anyone has any questions, please fire away.
Yeah. What was his theory about how the rumor started?
He believes, and it took a long time for him to come to this conclusion. For the longest time, he thought it was always Branch Rickey that was associated with the rumor. I mean, he first heard it from Branch Rickey, and then again, Chuck Dressen said that Branch Rickey was spreading it in a meeting. So in Babe's mind, he was thinking Rickey was involved in this. And then the more he thought about it, and the more he thought about who would have started this, and it came back to Joe McCarthy with the Yankees. And there's something happened in 1940 before spring training that really, really infuriated Joe McCarthy. Babe lived in San Francisco, and in 1940, before spring training, Babe went to Lefty O'Doul, who was also a San Francisco guy, and at the time manager of the San Francisco Seals. But Lefty O'Doul at that time was kind of Paul, you had mentioned earlier that there weren't any hitting coaches, and this is in the 70s that you're talking about. So back in the 40s, teams didn't have hitting coaches. And so, but Lefty O'Doul was known throughout the baseball world as being kind of a hitting guru. So Babe went to O'Doul in 1940 before spring training and asked O'Doul if he'd look at his swing. And O'Doul said yes. So Babe went out to where the Seals were having spring training and some workouts, and Babe went and worked out briefly for Lefty O'Doul to take a look at him. And O'Doul watched Babe take some batting practice, and he really didn't see much wrong with Babe's swing. He made a slight tweak here with keeping his weight back a little bit, but overall, he didn't think there was a problem with Babe's swing. Well, the newspapers were showing that Babe Dahlgren's meeting with Lefty O'Doul. I mean, that was splattered all across the papers. Lefty took it one step further and said that I don't know. He said Babe. He mentioned that he was working with Babe Dahlgren. And he was talking about how bad Babe's swing was, how he was doing nothing right, which is not what Lefty told Babe. But in the papers, Lefty was talking about how bad Babe's swing was, and how this is Lefty talking. I don't know why these big league managers are getting paid the salaries they are when they can't help their hitters. A direct shot at Joe McCarthy. A direct shot. Unbeknownst to me at the time that I was writing the book, I learned this later. Joe McCarthy hated Lefty O'Doul, did not like him at all. Going back to when Joe McCarthy was a manager for the Chicago Cubs. The Cubs signed O'Doul back in 1926, 27, 26. And then they signed O'Doul. And McCarthy sent O'Doul down in the minor leagues after spring training in 1926. And O'Doul bounced around the minor leagues for a bit. And O'Doul finally gets back to the big leagues with the Phillies. And in 1930, hits a couple of home runs late in the season against the Cubs, managed by McCarthy. And it really hurt the Cubs' chances to win the pennant in that year. And as O'Doul was running the bases, he yelled into the Cubs dugout at McCarthy, "There goes your pot of gold." Okay. And McCarthy is thinking USOB. McCarthy realized I had this guy at one point. I sent him down in the minor leagues. Things happened. He's now coming back to beat me, and he's rubbing my nose in it. McCarthy did not like O'Doul. So when McCarthy heard that Babe was working out with O'Doul in the spring of 1940, And then Babe goes to camp in 1940 and is leading the Yankees in home runs. McCarthy comes up to Babe in spring training of 1940 and says, "Hey, what are you doing different this spring?" And Babe says, "I don't know, maybe just having a little more luck, I guess." And McCarthy says, "Well, what's all this crap about you going to O'Doul?" And Babe was dumbfounded. He said, "Well, I went to Lefty, back home in San Francisco thinking, hey, if he can help me, that'll only help the Yankees. So and he says, well, he's like, McCarthy laid into Babe and said, I don't appreciate the stuff that Lefty's saying and blah, blah, blah. And Babe was like, whoa. And so when that meeting ended, Babe went up to Frankie Cressetti and said, Frank, I just got chewed out by McCarthy for seeing O'Doul. And Frank Cressetti said, yeah, when I got to spring training this year, Cressetti, McCarthy was stewing about you and O'Doul. He was talking to other coaches and other Yankee brass about it. And Babe thought, oh my God, my time as a Yankee is done. This is over. And sure enough, at the end of the year, they sold Babe. But Babe felt the entire 1940 season. He felt he felt McCarthy was just had it out for him. He just, by different actions throughout the year, different things McCarthy would say, he felt McCarthy had it out for him. So when the Yankees traded Babe, or sold Babe, I should say, when the Yankees sold Babe, and the writers all started questioning McCarthy, why would you do this? How could you do this? He's the best defensive first baseman in the game, and things like that. And now he's on the Cubs, and he's, hitting 23 home runs that season when his replacement in New York, Johnny Sturm, has 3. So the writers were starting to question McCarthy. And McCarthy, I believe, and Babe believed it, came up with this theory, this rumor of that Babe smoked marijuana to get people off of his back for selling Babe. So people would just stop asking him, why'd you sell Babe? It was Marty Appel talked to me when I was writing my book. And Marty told me, he goes, John Drebinger of the New York Times told Marty, this is Marty talking, he's like, John Drebinger told me that Joe McCarthy told him, John Drebinger, that Babe smoked marijuana. So that's when it all crystallized with me. And I didn't hear that until after Babe had passed away. But when Marty told me that John Drebinger was told by Joe McCarthy that Babe smoked marijuana, that's when I realized Joe McCarthy started this rumor, and Ricky heard about it, and Ricky used it in a contract negotiation with Babe, but it was started by McCarthy.
Matt, I just want to say once again, here's the book. Great book. Great presentation. I have to run, so I can't stick around for all the questions, but fantastic. It's great to see in person.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Mark, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I just find the irony amazing. Your grandfather gets screwed over a stigma of being a pot smoker when he wasn't a pot smoker. Yet the person pointing the fingers at him because he got stuck in the middle of a grudge war between O'Doul and McCarthy. McCarthy was one of the biggest lushes in baseball, which proved out by 1950. He cost the Red Sox 2 pennants with his managing. It's amazing. For McCarthy to sit there and point fingers at your grandfather, it's ridiculous.
Well, I appreciate that, and that's very true, and that's something that my grandfather always told me about McCarthy. There was, and I don't write this. I'll just mention this story really quick, but I didn't write this in the book. There was a game, and the Yankees were playing in Fenway Park one day where McCarthy he was in no condition to be in the dugout during the game. So the game started, and Art Fletcher and Earl Coombs were coaching the team that day, and it was the Yankees had essentially locked McCarthy in the clubhouse, told him to stay in the clubhouse. And around the 5th inning of that game, McCarthy comes walking down the third base foul line. There was an entrance down the wall at Fenway Park where you could enter in and out of. He came walking down into the Yankee dugout around the 5th inning of that game. I guess feeling that, okay, he was in the condition to be at the helm. But to your point, yeah, he liked to drink quite a bit. And anyway, you are correct in saying that. So
Did you try to find out if there were any major league ball players in the 30s, 40s, 50s who did smoke marijuana?
you know, I've never come across any, but let me just say this. In my book, there's a quote I have from let me find it here. This is from Al Lopez, who was a teammate of Babe's with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And this is Al Lopez on whether or not he heard the rumor. Quote, "I heard something about it, yeah. It was hard to prove, and I think it was hearsay. But a guy accused of something like that, you're not going to want him on your club." Now, that was Al Lopez. And so that's the point. The consensus back in the 40s, when all this was surfacing, it's not as, you know, nowadays, I mean, hell, it's legal in most states, but nowadays it's people would laugh if you said, yeah, I was accused of smoking marijuana. Back then, it could get you kicked out of baseball. And that's what Babe feared. And when the more he heard it, and the more players that were coming to him privately saying, hey, what's going on? What is this I'm hearing? Blah, blah, blah. It would keep Babe awake at night. He'd lay in bed at night and think to himself, how do I stop this? How do I stop a rumor? And that's what, I mean, really the last half of his life, it bothered him. And that's why he was doing this. He wanted his story told. So, I mean, there's a lot of other little stories and anecdotes I tell in my book that aren't related to that. But that's the driving force behind the book and why I wrote the book, because it bothered him so much.
Matt, thank you. I wanted to follow up on Mark. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's what I was going to follow up. Just ask,
Go ahead.
when he got into the second half of his career, where he was I remember I heard a little bit of your story at Bruce McClure's SABR meet when he was sort of like a batting coach for the Kansas City A's. I guess maybe later the Oakland A's. That stigma kind of died down at that point. He was later on in his life, and he was doing a video thing to help the hitters out. And have he kind of like gone past that, where there's a new day at a different time? And
it always stayed with him. But you know, there was a new generation of ball players, and you know, the guys in the game at that time hadn't heard it and weren't aware of it. And he kept it internal. He internalized it, but it was nothing that he encountered during that aspect of his career. And just really quick, if I can touch on that, and I appreciate you bringing that up. In the late 50s, when my grandfather was working with his two boys, my dad and my uncle, he'd throw them batting practice every day, and they were aspiring professional ball players as well. And so he would throw to them every day. And he realized that he could see their faults in their swings, but they couldn't see their faults. So it was one thing for Babe to be able to tell his kids, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this right, but try doing this. But unless you, the hitter, can see it, it's hard to understand and comprehend what a coach is trying to tell you. So in the late 50s, Babe invested thousands of dollars into the best movie cameras, sound systems, you name it. And he started driving across the country and filming major leaguers at spring training facilities. He started compiling all this footage, interviewing players. And then he made a 90-minute movie on hitting and I don't want to say the science of hitting, that's Ted Williams's book, but he made a movie on hitting as far as the fundamentals involved, what a good swing looks like, what a bad swing looks like, what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. He took this 90-minute movie in 1963 in the winter meetings that were in Los Angeles. He goes to a hotel in Los Angeles with his movies, trying to get a job with a major league team, pitching it to them saying, hey, you need film. You need somebody filming your hitters so they know what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And the one guy at the winter meetings, the one owner that was willing to listen to Babe was Charlie Finley. Babe showed his film to Charlie Finley at the winter meetings in 1963, and they ended up spending almost 6 hours in a hotel suite watching the film, having lunch, and right there on the spot, Finley hired Babe to be the batting coach / film coach for the 1964 Kansas City A's. So during the 1964 season, Babe filmed, he was in uniform during batting practice and on the field talking to hitters and whatnot. But then once the game started, he was in the front row of the ballpark. In Kansas City, they had a couple of seats in the front row for him. When they go on the road, Finley bought a couple of front row seats for him. And Babe would sit there with his film cameras and film every at bat of the 1964 A's hitters. And he'd have cartridges, films for each guy. And it was a production. I mean, when a new hitter would come up, he'd have to get under a black screen, take the film cartridge out, put in the new guy's film cartridge and film that guy. If once he made out, they'd take that cartridge out, put in the next guy. It was a whole system he had. He'd go back to his room at night, develop the film, show the film to the hitters the following day if they wanted to see it. Oftentimes on the road, there was no screen in the clubhouse to put film on. They'd hang a white sheet outside the clubhouse in the runway between the dugout and the clubhouse. They'd hang a white sheet, a bed sheet, and show the film up on the bed sheet for the hitters to look at. That was in 1964. At the end of the 64 season, Finley thought, you know what, I'm not seeing any bang for my buck here, and he let Babe and a lot of the coaching staff go. The 1965 Cardinals picked Babe up to do the same thing for them. So in 1965, Babe's filming all the Cardinals games. Same thing, same concept. But again, this is before anyone's doing this. So no one's really realizing, now you watch a game and you're seeing players looking at iPads in the dugout after every at-bat and studying their at-bats. Every dugout has it. Every clubhouse has a film room. This is before any of that. And so in 1965, he's doing the same thing with the Cardinals. And at the end of that year, they didn't see any value in it, and they fired Babe. So now he's out of baseball, and he's back home in California, and he opens up an indoor batting cage, and he's giving batting lessons and things like that. In 1970, mid-season, Charlie Finley calls him again with the Oakland A's now and says, hey, we're struggling. I want you back. I want you to film my hitters, blah, blah, blah. Babe joins the Oakland A's, starts doing the same thing. And at the time, the A's' hitting coach was Charlie Lau in 1970. Lau didn't like it too much that the Finley hired Babe to come in and start filming hitters and to kind of be another hitting coach. Ironically, in 1964, when Babe first started doing this with the Kansas City A's, Lau was a backup catcher for the Kansas City A's in 1964. Lau was there when Babe first came into the game with his film. He showed the film to all the guys. And now here he is 6 years later with the Oakland A's, and Lau's the hitting coach. And Lau didn't like it too much that Babe was there, and there was some friction there. And at the end of that season, this coaching staff was fired. Lau went to Kansas City, and a few years later, Lau starts videoing players and gets credit for videoing players. And George Brett is one of his big proteges and all that. I'm not taking anything away from Charlie Lau, but everything Lau started doing with Kansas City, Babe was doing in 1964 with the Kansas City A's. So anyway, that's my spiel on that. Yes.
What's up with the ask? Is there anybody that your grandfather mentioned that was kind of an interested student in that film video hitting that he was doing? Anybody that you mentioned that was really took to it?
An interesting story on that. Babe's approach was always, he would tell the guys, hey, I've got film on all of you. If you want to see it, all you got to do is ask me. So, and he would make that, he told the guys in 1964 that, he told the guys with the Cardinals in 65, and then again with the A's in 70. There was an incident in 1970 where Reggie Jackson was struggling a bit for the A's, and throughout the 70 season was being benched periodically and kind of regularly in the middle of the season. It was really infuriating Reggie. There was an incident too that's kind of a known thing where Reggie hits a pinch hit home run in Oakland, and when he crosses home plate, he looks up to Finley's box and he flips Finley off, and that was a big thing. That anyway, Reggie Jackson, they're on the road in Detroit, and Reggie Jackson asked Babe. He'd never wanted to see any film, and Babe's phone rings in his hotel suite, and it's Reggie. And he says, "Can I come over and watch some film?" And Babe said, "Absolutely." So Reggie Jackson comes in, and Babe sets up his projector, and they start watching all of Reggie's film. And they're in there for, quite a long time, and they're studying Reggie and things like that. And the following day in Detroit, Reggie comes in and hits a pinch hit home run to dead center field. Again, he had been struggling for a bit throughout the 70 season, and he hits a home run to dead center field. And Babe felt pretty good about that, knowing that the night before they were just looking at all the film and going over things. So there were guys, depending on the team. Jim Gentile liked to watch film in '64 with the A's. Rocky Colavito liked to watch film in '64 with the A's. With the Cardinals in '65, Bill White, would watch. Kurt Flood would watch. A handful of guys would come in and watch. But I just thought the Jackson story, the Reggie story, was interesting in 1970. How he came into his hotel suite and they watched film, and then the following day he goes out and hits a home run to dead center field. So Babe always felt that it was a crucial part of the game that no one was using. And he had this vision in the late 50s when he went out and bought all the equipment. And here we are today in 2023, where everything is analytic driven. Every hitter is looking at every swing they take. Every pitcher is looking at every pitch they throw. It's all video. And he was doing this in 1964 with the Kansas City A's.
If I may follow up, and Matt, we appreciate what you've done here. It seems to me that your grandfather was a definite pioneer and didn't get the credit he deserved. Plus, with what you said about the rumors about him, if he hadn't been traded, he would probably be a lot more well remembered today than he is, because he had to deal with succeeding Gehrig just like Selkirk succeeding Ruth a few years before. So, but if your grandfather had been treated more fairly, given what you said about his hitting and his defense, I think people would remember him a lot more today. And I wanted to ask you, did you play ball at any organized level, or your father?
Yes, in fact, we both did. So my dad and his brother played professional baseball. My dad signed with Houston in 1965. Signed as a pitcher in the Astros organization, and he hurt his arm early on in that year in 1965. In fact, his roommate, and it's kind of funny, his roommate with Houston in the minor leagues was John Pachorik, who is known for having what's the perfect batting average? He hit 1,000. He got one major league game and had
three in one game.
Exactly. So my dad's roommate with the Astros in the minor leagues was John Pachorik. But my dad hurt his arm early on in 1965 and then was released. And then a couple years later, the Red Sox actually signed him to play first base because my dad could hit. And so the Red Sox picked him up in 1968. He goes to spring training in 1968 with the Red Sox. And then my dad just had terrible luck. He tore his quad muscle in spring training running the bases. And he just bad luck. My uncle pitched a few years in the minor leagues. Myself, I wanted to obviously follow in my grandfather's footsteps and my dad's footsteps. So I played high school and college baseball. I didn't get drafted out of college. I felt I might have had a shot at getting drafted. I didn't, but I stayed in shape, still wanting to try to hook on with somebody. And in 1993, there was a new independent league that formed. It's called the Frontier League. The league is still going today. I flew out to Chillicothe, Ohio for a tryout for that league. It was the inaugural season for the league. And a team out of West Virginia, the West Virginia Coal Sox, signed me. We got into the season about 3 weeks into the season. The league had 8 teams at the time. And we're about 3 weeks into the season, and my team goes bankrupt. My team and another team go bankrupt, and they send us home. So that's the extent of my professional baseball career. I was on the West Virginia Coal Sox in the Frontier League. And then The problem is that whoever, when they set the league up, they had us in Huntington, West Virginia, but we were competing with the Huntington Cubs at the time, an A-ball team for the Chicago Cubs. So if you lived in and around Huntington, West Virginia, you were going to go to the Cubs games, not the West Virginia Coal Sox games. And we just had nobody come to our games, and we just went bankrupt quickly. And so that was my foray into professional baseball. It lasted about 3 weeks. I came back home to California and coached high school and college a little bit before I got out of it altogether and got into the real world. So, but yeah, I gave it a shot, and that's what that's my professional baseball story.
I appreciate
I
it.
was a switch hitting catcher.
Nice, it's good. Do people ever give you like requests about like analogous to what you presented for us today? Request to talk about your grandfather and maybe to clear the air about some things or to give him belated recognition?
You know, like I said earlier, when the book came out, I did a lot of these speaking engagements, and I did some various interviews for some radio interviews and some newspaper interviews, and I was very pleased and very happy with how people were receiving it, and I was really honored with the ability to be able to share his story and have people hear it and whatnot. It's been a long time, frankly, since I've even talked about my grandfather and the book, and it wasn't until last month that I spoke to the other SABR chapter, and now this chapter, which I'm very grateful for. Anytime I can speak about my grandfather and trying to tell his story and clear his name, I'll stop whatever I'm doing to do that. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And like I said, just if you were to go to rumorintown.com, I have a lot of quotes on there from writers at the time. I have photos on there, a lot of different things, which will kind of show a little more about what it is I'm talking about here.
Oh, thank you. Any further questions? Ready to wrap this up then? Listen, thank you very much, Matt. Much appreciated.
I thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. You all have a great day.
You too. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, all right, so let's wrap things up.
Who do I pay? What?
Yes, in order to defray expenses, especially since due to budget cuts, we have to pay for security, then because Alan said that once I get the invoice, he'll write the check, but if everyone could please give me the usual $5 and are any of you gonna go to Rhode Island the Saturday after Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
If we maybe carpool and go to Ryan's Deli for dinner.
Yeah, I'm not going this year. That's my daughter.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Where is your daughter?
North Carolina.
Oh, good.
Mark Wise, you need.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stan. And Stan, you'll be working on, thank you, Gary, on the holiday lunch. By the way, for the spring meeting, I'd asked Mark Cantor to do a presentation about what you mentioned about Koufax's last game. Would you be able to do that for our spring meeting? Sure. It's a good topic.
That's a World Series game? No. It's the Philly, the game in Philadelphia.
Okay.
First game I believe it's the first game I ever watched.
In
Okay, so anyway, but before everybody knows, I have a question that I've been thinking about this even before the Philly. I've traveled to South Korea, Japan, watched baseball there, and they run their playoffs differently, especially South Korea. What happens is, now what the better team, the team with the better winning percentage, when they make the playoffs, what happens is, let's say, I think in South Korea you have 6 teams in the league, the top 3 teams make the playoffs. The second 2 teams play off against each other, but the team with the better record gets a win They already have a win in hand before the playoffs start. So if you're playing best 2 out of 3, or 3 out of 5, they've already got the win, so the other team has to win those games.
I like that rule.
Tony Clark has